Chapter 475. It was windy and snowy in the forest at night. However, the seemingly light snow was not blown away by the howling night wind, nor did it disappear into the dense snow. Instead, it fell from the sky alone and arrogantly, ignoring the surrounding wind and its companions. It slowly floated down and landed on the shoulder of the third Minister of Offerings. The third Minister of Offerings of Qinghe County was bound by the monk's emblematic gesture. He sat cross-legged in the snow and could not move at all. He could only watch the thin snow fall on his shoulder and could not help but feel confused. When the thin snow fell, the monk stopped walking toward the lakeside. His straw sandals sunk deep into the thick snow. Then he turned around and looked at the thin snow in silence. Suddenly, there was a rustling sound in the forest. The sound was like sharp pieces of ice rubbing against each other. Accompanied by the wind and snow, it was naturally mournful and sounded like the chirping of cicadas. Cicadas were creatures of summer and would be silent in the autumn wind. In this context, cold cicadas were silent. However, the wind and snow were cold tonight, and there seemed to be countless cicadas in the forest. Those cicadas hid behind the branches, in the upturned bark, hanging between the spider webs, and sitting in the ice and snow. They watched the falling snow and the monk in the wind and snow, chirping wantonly. The cicadas kept chirping. The forest was full of cold cicadas. The chirping of the cicadas in the forest became more and more intense and mournful. The thick snow on the branches was shaken and fell down. However, there seemed to be two large and invisible cicada wings above the forest by the lake, covering the whole sky and preventing the chirping of the cicadas from spilling out of the forest. The mournful chirping of the cicadas was colder than the snow and more elusive than the night wind. It sounded everywhere, returned to silence, and revived everywhere. Finally, it fell into the ears of the monk. The chirping of the cicadas in the forest seemed to be indifferently saying, "Repent and you will be saved." The monk listened to the increasingly mournful chirping of the cicadas, and his expression became more and more solemn. His name was Qi Nian. He came from the Xiankong Temple and was a powerful world wayfarer of the Buddhism sect. Because of the records in the temple, he came to Chang'an to see the legendary son of Yama. He was even ready to kill that person even if he had to face the academy. Ever since he started to practice silent meditation, his Zen heart and willpower had become firmer and firmer. Even the countless powerhouses in Chang'an and the mountain of the academy in the south of the city could not move him. Logically speaking, no sound should be able to stop his footsteps. But these cicadas were different. Because he knew that these cicadas represented a person. He was the most mysterious person in the world, and could even be said to be the most terrifying person in the world. Even if the chief preaching monk of the Xiankong Temple was here, he would have to treat the cicadas with the utmost caution. Qi Nian's expression was solemn, even with the respect that a junior should have. But his eyes were still firm, and he slowly pointed to the Yanming Lake behind him. He used this action to tell the person behind the cicada that his higan was over there. The third Minister of Offerings of Qinghe County was tied up by the snow rope made by the emblematic gesture of the Buddhism sect and could not move at all. But he could see, hear the mournful chirping of cicadas in the forest. Looking at the thin snow on his shoulder, his face became paler and paler, and his expression became more and more frightened. He was a grand cultivator of the knowing destiny state, and he knew many secrets of the cultivation world in the Qinghe County book collection. Although he was not sure, he had vaguely guessed the identity of the person in the forest. To cause the cicadas to cry in such a snowy night, and to make the Vedanta of the Xiankong Temple so solemn, it could only be the most mysterious master of the devil's doctrine in the world, the 23-year cicada cultivation. After the front gate of the devil's doctrine was destroyed, the force that had once set off bloody storms in the world had withered. But no one dared to ignore the current master of the devil's doctrine. For many years, no one had seen the master of the devil's doctrine, or even heard of him. So the master became the most mysterious legend in the cultivation world. Rumor had it that the master of the devil's doctrine was possessed by the devil while practicing the 23-year cicada cultivation and had already turned into a pile of bones. But some people also said that the master of the devil's doctrine was hiding somewhere in the world, watching the world indifferently, and might appear at any time to summon the wind and rain again. But no matter what, no one in the cultivation world would forget this person. Even those who believed that he was dead, in fact, were frightened and uneasy at night. They always felt that one day, the master of the devil's doctrine would reappear in front of the world at a moment that no one could imagine. It was indeed a moment that no one could imagine. At least it was a moment that the third minister of offerings of Qinghe County could not imagine. Just before the decisive battle between Ning Ke of the Academy and General Xiaofan, the world wayfarers of Taoism and Buddhism sects arrived in Chang'an. 23-year cicada cultivation actually reappeared in the world. The third minister of offerings was terrified. But then, he thought that the master of the devil's doctrine was confronting the Vedanta of Xiankong Temple, and he thought that he might have a chance to survive. His eyes rolled subconsciously. His eyes turned slightly, and out of the corner of his eye, he saw the snow on his shoulder that was as thin as a cicada's wing. Then he remembered that he had forgotten something in the legend. According to the legend, the master of the devil's doctrine did not kill many people because he disdained to kill ordinary people. He thought that only grand cultivators in the knowing destiny state were qualified to be killed by him. According to the legend, the reason why the master of the devil's doctrine was the most mysterious person in the world was that he would kill everyone who had heard the sound of cicadas. The third minister of offerings was in the knowing destiny state, and he had heard the sound of cicadas tonight. The third minister of offerings understood this, and then he died. The snowflake that was as thin as a cicada's wing flapped its wings and gently wedged itself into his old neck. Blood spurted out from his neck and sprayed into the wind and snow, making a hissing sound. It was also like the sound of cicadas. The sound of cicadas was the sound of the vibration of the drum of cicadas. It could vibrate thousands of times in an instant. Therefore, it could tear silk when it was clear, make people cry when it was sad, and make them feel sad when it was bleak. The sound of blood splashing was the vibration of the friction between the blood and the wound. It was similar to the sound of cicadas, so the sound was similar and could be equally sad. The mute monk turned around and looked at the third minister of offerings of Qinghe County, who was sitting cross-legged in the deep snow. He frowned slightly, knowing that this was a warning from the man in the forest. He was a disciple of Buddhism. He could kill people, but he did not want to. That was why he used the emblematic gesture of the Buddhism sect to bind the minister of offerings. However, he did not expect that he would become the accomplice of the powerhouse from the devil's doctrine. The monk knew why the 23-year cicada cultivation reappeared in the world, and why it used the sound of cicadas to stop him from going to Yanming Lake. Because Xiaofan was a traitor of the devil's doctrine, and he was someone that the 23-year cicada cultivation had to kill. If the master of the devil's doctrine was really dead, then it would be fine. But since he was still alive, he had to kill Xiaofan, or watch him die. The master of the devil's doctrine had probably endured for many years because of the academy and the imperial court of the Tang Empire. Now that the academy had decided to kill Xiaofan, how could he allow others to intervene? The 23-year cicada cultivation might be afraid of the headmaster of the academy. But he would never be afraid of the Xiankong Temple or the Zhishou Abbey. The mute monk could understand the intention of the sound of cicadas, but it did not mean that he could accept it. The frost on his eyelashes evaporated, and the snow on his body turned into warm water and dripped down. He knew that even if he spoke tonight, he might not be able to defeat that person. But that person could definitely set off a bloody storm in the world. If he was facing Mr. First, Mr. Second, or even the headmaster of the academy, the monk could ignore them, because he knew that the academy would not be so shameless. But that person was 23-year cicada cultivation. That person could do anything. So he was angry, but he still could not speak. After saying this, the person in the depths of the night forest did not speak again. But Qi Nian knew that he was still here, because the cicadas were still chirping. The monk could not speak, nor could he sigh. He could only sigh softly in his heart, and then disperse the Akalanatha seal. He put his palms together to guard his heart, and then slowly closed his eyes. The snowflakes continued to fall like cicadas, covering the monk's body and covering his facial features, turning the successor of Xiankong Temple into a snowman in the night forest. The snow that had been falling for a whole day and night suddenly became lighter at this time. The chirping of cicadas in the forest gradually became weaker, but it became more and more sad. Cold cicadas were sad. Facing the winter lake, the heavy snow had just stopped. Let me be excited. This is also the picture that I have been writing for a whole year. Maybe half of the fun of writing a novel is here. Tomorrow is Saturday. See you the day after tomorrow. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 476. Beside the Yanming Lake, the mountains on the south bank and the snow forest on the east bank were all quiet. There was no sound, let alone the sound of cicadas. On the city wall, eldest brother and Yi Su looked through the heavy snow and fell on the forest. Their expressions were slightly strange, as if they felt something was happening there. However, they did not have the energy to pay attention to what was happening in the snow forest, because they saw the blood flag fluttering in front of the Yanming Lake house. Xia Ho pushed the door open and entered. The courtyard door was a little new, as if it had been repaired not long ago. Xia Ho pushed the door open and entered the dark courtyard. He suddenly heard the sound of cicadas, and his body could not help but stiffen. During the day in the imperial palace, he also vaguely heard the sound of cicadas coming from the dancing snowflakes in front of the hall. He was sure that it was an auditory hallucination, but at this time, although the sound was still unreal, it seemed to be a little real. The indifferent expression on Xia Ho's face did not change at all. He slightly raised his eyebrows and looked more violent. He steadily stepped over the threshold and walked through the corridor to the main hall. There was a short pause in the snow, and then it flew more violently. Thick clouds covered the sky full of stars, and the wind and snow dimmed the lights in Chang'an. It was so dark beside the Yanming Lake that one could not see his fingers in front of him, but Xia Ho could see everything clearly. There were a few winter plums planted under the stone steps. For some reason, the plum branches were scattered, and fresh stubble could be seen under the snow. It seemed that they had been eaten by some elegant animals. There was a pot of green plant in the house. Even in the cold winter, the plant was still growing vigorously. Its branches and leaves were plump and green, which made the yellow soil in the pot even more boring. The thick and straight black beam on the roof was slightly deformed. It should have been hit by some kind of impact, and there were two very small cracks on it. It did not seem to affect safety, but it was still a little scary to look at. On the side of the unique display shelf, there was an oil lamp. The oil lamp was made of celadone, and the lamp string was white. When it was not lit, it was also a very beautiful work of art. Ning Kei had spent countless taels of silver on this house by the Yanming Lake, and Mr. Qi had spent a lot of effort on it. Moreover, it had been bought by Her Majesty and Li Yu, so it was extraordinary. Compared with those famous gardens in Qinghe County, it was not inferior. Even the inconspicuous things were worth appreciating. Xia Ho was a general and would never be sentimental about the changing seasons. Naturally, he had no interest in this aspect. However, in the face of a great battle, his gaze on the plum bushes, black beams, bonsai, and oil lamp was so focused. In fact, he did not look at the plum bushes, the black beams, the bonsai, or the oil lamp. He was looking at the yellow paper peeking out from the snow on the plum trees, the yellow paper stuck between the cracks of the black beams, the yellow paper in the bonsai, the yellow paper under the celadon lamp. In this world, there was a kind of paper that was usually yellowish. It was called fu paper. There were talisman papers everywhere in the house by the Yanming Lake. This was a residence made of talismans. The reason why Yi Hongyu could defeat Chen Pipi was that she knew him and knew his fear. I also know Xia Ho very well. Since the day he betrayed the devil's doctrine, Xia Ho has been afraid. Maybe he was afraid of the mysterious grandmaster of the devil's doctrine, or maybe he was afraid that the West Hill Divine Palace would expose his identity. Because of fear, he felt empty. He began to kill people like flies and began to be cruel and arrogant. Ning Ke took the big black umbrella from Sang Sang and looked at the courtyard shrouded in the night snow. Only in this way can he get rid of his psychological shadow. What he said in front of the palace gates was right. I also have a psychological shadow, so I understand that his pride is a fatal weakness that he cannot get rid of. Because of his pride, he has now stepped into the battlefield that I have chosen. This is the first mistake he has made. How to make use of his mistake? I don't know. I only know that I must not hesitate to use more than 300 talismans that I have painstakingly written in the past 2 years. Writing talismans was not as casual as it seemed. Except for Ning Ke himself, not many people knew how many sleepless nights he had spent writing more than 300 talismans, how many times his psyche power was exhausted, and how many times his sense of perception had been shaken. Sang Sang knew. Because of those nights accompanied by oil lamps, she had been waiting by Ning Ke's side. She saw him sweat like beans and his face was pale, but he still wrote. In those nights, Ning Ke was not plowing the fields, nor writing the articles, but only the talismans. On the edge of the cliff in the snow, Sang Sang looked up at Ning Quebec. Seeing that his face was as pale as those nights, she was very worried. But she smiled and said, "Yes, young master will definitely win." Ning Ke closed his eyes and held the handle of the umbrella. His eyebrows and right hand were trembling, and his face was pale. The psyche power in his sense of perception spread along the black umbrella into the snow-filled sky. Psyche power was the foundation of orthodox cultivators. However, cultivators could only use psyche power to control the chi of heaven and earth, and then use various means. Even if a psyche master could directly attack the enemy with psyche power, it was limited to a very short distance. That was because psyche power had a characteristic that could not be changed. This characteristic was that once the psyche power left the cultivator's sense of perception, it would rapidly disperse with the distance and return to nature. Ning Ke was standing on the cliff on the south bank of Yanming Lake. He was a few miles away from the courtyard on the other side of the lake. If he wanted to trigger the 300 talismans hidden in the courtyard, he needed to send his psyche power to the other side. However, how could his psyche power cross the winter lake in the night snow? At this moment, something amazing happened. After his psyche power passed through the handle and the surface of the big black umbrella, there was an obvious change. It was not that the concentration of the psyche power had increased, but the speed at which it dispersed into the snow had slowed down. Because of the acupoint obstruction tune in the ocean of chi and mountain of snow, the aura of heaven and earth around the lake could not understand the song that he sang with his psyche power. But at least his voice could travel further. Ning Ke's psyche power quietly passed through the wind and snow and landed in the courtyard on the opposite bank. The yellow paper that was under the celadon lamp turned into nothingness with a slight sound. A faint sense of dryness came out of nowhere. The white, jade-like lamp rope that had never been lit suddenly tightened. The oil was released and a weak flame was ignited. The oil lamp was dim, but it slightly illuminated the inside and outside of the hull. As the celadon lamp strangely ignited without fire, there were countless changes in the room. The display shelf where the oil lamp was located was completely ignited. However, the space where the display shelf was also ignited, turning into a blazing fireball that covered Xia Ho's mountain-like body. The fire was faintly discernible and terrifying. Wherever it passed, everything was turned into nothingness. Only the green plant in the pot was different. The slightly drooping, green and tender green leaves melted like fat when they were burned by the tongue of fire in the room. They turned into light green oil and dripped into the flower pot. The yellow foux paper that was stuck in the green leaf disappeared. The green leaf turned into oil and fell into the soil. The flower pot suddenly cracked and the yellow soil inside exploded, filling the space in the room. The granular yellow dust was unknowingly extremely heavy. Every grain of gravel was like a stone, shooting toward Xiaoho's body. Then, the yellow paper on the black beam disappeared into thin air. With a loud crack, the heavy beam broke from the middle without warning and smashed toward Xiaoho's head. Xiaoho squinted his eyes. His iron-like eyebrows were not furrowed. They reflected the fire and seemed to be burning. He punched. That terrifying fist was so domineering that it squeezed out all the air in front of him. The blazing talisman fire was suddenly extinguished. It was extremely gloomy. He closed his eyes. He let the yellow gravel hit his body like stones. There was a series of crackling sounds. Countless tiny but powerful pieces of gravel smashed into his body. It was like countless hailstones falling from the sky and hitting the eaves of the palace. The robe on his body was instantly riddled with holes. But there was no expression on his face. He lowered his head. The two halves of the black beam smashed into his back. Then it broke into more pieces. The heavy beam could kill a dozen people. But it could not make his body tremble. Facing Ning Kei's 3 talismans, Xiaoho only punched. This was the peak of martial arts. Especially since he was originally a powerhouse of the Devil's Doctrine, he could ignore any attack below the knowing destiny state as long as he closed his eyes. The yellow gravel that shot out like flying stones did not leave any mark on his face. The broken beam rolled and groaned under his feet. He was not hurt at all. Only one eyelash floated away from his eyes. With Xiaoho's cultivation state, he did not have to face Ning Kei's 3 talismans directly. He could have avoided them. He could have used the simplest way to break them with a wave of his hand. The reason why he did not do so was that he had been paying attention to the broken plum flowers under the stone steps behind him. Ning Kei thought he knew him very well. He also thought he knew Ning Kei very well. He knew how cold and sinister Ning Kei was. He believed that Ning Kei would never waste 3 precious talismans just to test his strength. There must be a backup plan. There was also a yellow talisman in the broken plum flowers. Xiaoho thought it was Ning Kei's killing move, so he focused on it. As expected, the next moment, the yellow talisman in the broken plum flowers turned into a wisp of smoke. The few remaining plum flowers trembled and left the branches. They flew like butterflies to the back of Xiaoho's head. Xiaoho did not look back. He casually pointed behind him. When his fingertips touched the plum petal, his iron eyebrows suddenly frowned. The petal turned into a drop of water. The talisman in the broken plum flowers turned out to be such a shallow water talisman. Xiaoho frowned because he found that he had made a mistake in his judgment. But he did not care. He looked up with an indifferent expression. The black beam had been broken. There was a big hole in the roof. People under the eaves could see the starry sky when they looked up. It was windy and snowy tonight. There were no stars to see. Only countless snowflakes could be seen pouring in from the hole along with the night wind. There was also a talisman that was gradually dissipating into coldness. The snowflakes that fell from the hole seemed to have grown many times larger as they danced in the air. An extremely cold talisman suddenly enveloped the entire building. Even the air in the building froze. Xiaoho looked up at the falling snow. His eyebrows were instantly covered with a thick layer of frost. I was too excited when I wrote the 2 chapters the day before yesterday. which resulted in a serious increase in typos. I have changed them in the document. The mistakes in the VIP chapter will not be dealt with for technical reasons. I am going to massage and drink. Have a good weekend. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. The invisible chi of heaven and earth armor, together with the visible metal armor, tightly isolated him from the surrounding heaven and earth, and from the storm of talisman intent and the turbulence of chi. Xia Ho lifted his feet and walked among the yellow talismans that were flying all over the sky. The violent talisman intent kept hitting his body, making muffled sounds or sharp cutting sounds. Under the attack of the talisman, the armor on his body was sometimes covered with a thick layer of ice, and sometimes it was bright red and dazzling, as if it had been burned for 7 days and 7 nights. In order to resist the sea of talisman intent, his psyche power was slowly and irreversibly consumed, but the expression on his face still did not change at all, and his footsteps were still so stable. Xia Ho was very clear that Ning Ke was the successor of Master Yen Sei and was regarded as the future divine talisman master by the world, so he was very sure what he would face in the battle tonight. However, the number of talismans prepared by Ning Ke was far more than what he had calculated before. What was more unexpected was that Ning Ke would display all his talisman Taoism skills at the beginning of the battle. It should be known that a talisman master needed to touch the talisman with psyche power, and the distance that the psyche power could spread was congenitally limited. At this time, the lakeside house was full of flying talisman papers, which could only mean that Ning Ke was in the house at this time. Xia Ho thought that Ning Ke's approach was very confident, very proud, very arrogant, and also very idiotic. Any cultivator who fought with a powerhouse at the peak state of martial arts but did not try to keep a distance was an idiot. Since Ning Ke was by the lakeside, then he was not in a hurry to leave the sea of talisman storm. He let the talisman storm continue to consume his psyche power, because he wanted to find Ning Ke and then kill him in one fell swoop. He continued to walk forward without any movement, and a grey wall in front of him suddenly collapsed. He looked at the deep night, looked at the faintly visible lake willows in the south of the house, and said with slight mockery, "If it is not a divine talisman, how can it hurt me? Since you are so eager to die, then die." Yanming Lake was irregular. The west bank of the lake was relatively narrow and far away. The lake water was clear and shallow. Someone built a wooden bridge across the lake, and people could enjoy the water plants in the lake. It was winter, and the wooden bridge was full of snow. The lake water under the bridge had all condensed into solid thick ice, and the green silk-like water plants could no longer be seen. Only a few yellow and white reeds swayed in the wind could be seen. In such cold weather, the imperial court had blocked the area around Yanming Lake, so naturally there were no tourists. However, there were a few people standing on both sides of the wooden bridge, looking at the west of the lake with different expressions. Yi Hongyu's green Taoist robe was a little loose, and it fluttered in the wind and snow. She looked at the lakeside house in the distance, and felt the talisman storm there. There was a trace of surprise in her eyes. She had lived in that house for a long time, but it was not until now that she knew what Ning Ke had done in the house and how many terrifying talisman papers he had hidden. The Tao addict was an extremely confident person, but she had to admit that if Ning Ke used the talisman storm to deal with her, she would definitely be in an extremely difficult situation. On the other side of the wooden bridge, Chen Pipi held an oil paper umbrella in one hand, and held Tang Xiaotang's small hand in the other. He looked at the shining light in the distance from time to time in the west, and looked at the countless yellow papers dancing like a waterfall. He said in shock, "We all know that youngest brother is stingy, but who would have thought that he would make such an extravagant move tonight?" Tang Xiaotang's hand was a little cold. She was worried about her friend's current situation, and also shocked by the impact of the talisman papers by the lake. She murmured, talisman is such a terrible thing. On the cliff of the south bank of Yanming Lake, Ning Kai opened his eyes and looked at the talisman paper storm in the house on the other side of the lake. He heard the faint sound of the wall falling and the tiles flying. I asked seventh sister to design the tactical array and the big black umbrella to make Xiaofan make a wrong judgment, to make him think that I am in the house. Xiaofan is actually very cautious and suspicious. On this basis, he has abnormal confidence. Since he judged that I am there, he will definitely believe that I am there. He said sarcastically, maybe he is still taunting me at this time, asking me to come out and fight to my heart's content. Sang Sang looked at the other side of the lake and frowned. She said, but his strength is too strong, and the talisman sea seems to be unable to deal with him. I never expected this talisman storm to directly defeat Xiaofan. After all, I am not a divine talisman master. The talisman papers I sprinkled in the flower pots may only become useless smoke on his armor like moths flying into the fire, but there may be talismans that can cut off one of his eyelashes. He continued, a falling eyelash is nothing, and he may not even notice it himself. But many a little makes a mickle, and it can be fatal. Just like walking, as long as you keep walking, one day you will get to the place you want to go. Even if Xiaofan is an indestructible mountain and my method is an inconspicuous spoon, if I keep hitting it, even if I keep hitting it for a long time, this mountain will still be loosened by me. The surface of the mountain will loosen, the rocks will turn into powder and fall, and the mountain will collapse and the earth will shake. After saying this, Ning Kai handed the big black umbrella in his hand to Sang Sang. Sang Sang took the big black umbrella and looked at him. She said, yes, young master, you will definitely win. Ning Kai's psyche power was rapidly consumed by triggering hundreds of talismans at the same time across the lake. His face was a little pale, but his eyes were still calm. He looked at the other side of the lake and slowly raised his right arm. His fingers trembled uneasily, as if there was a heavy mountain hanging between his fingers with invisible strings. He slowly moved his right arm and drew 2 horizontal and 2 vertical lines in the wind and snow in front of him. The invisible and dignified lines pointed to the house on the other side of Yanming Lake. In the house, the yellow paper that was dancing in the sky all turned into nothingness, and the dazzling light gradually faded. The violent and terrifying talisman intent was still constantly tearing the chi of heaven and earth. It was calm but contained danger. In the relatively sparse snowy night elsewhere in Chang'an, 4 faint lines appeared. Those lines had no color and should be transparent and invisible, but they could be seen. The reason why the 4 lines could be seen was that the dancing snowflakes in the night sky suddenly fled in all directions. Some of the snowflakes that could not escape quietly turned into nothingness. The 4 lines in the night sky were traces of no snow. The 4 lines, 2 horizontal and 2 vertical, formed a Jing character. The violent talisman intent in the night sky all condensed in this Jing character. Well, both horizontal and vertical, meant to cut. Jing Fu was the most terrifying and profound talisman intent of Master Yen Sei when he was alive. Before he perished together with the great divine priest of light at the top of the nameless mountain, the Jing Fu that he used could even cut the space and cut off the Haotian divine flame that the great divine priest of light obtained in the Tianqi state in the space. Ning Kai inherited all the mantle of Master Yen Sei, so he was naturally the most diligent in the study of Jing Fu. Although his state was not enough and he could not fully exert the power of Jing Fu, the Jing Fu he wrote was already powerful enough and was the most powerful talisman he could use now. And he didn't know when he could cast talismans in the indefinite form. This method was already close to the level of calligraphy addict Mo Shanshan in the wilderness. In other words, this well talisman was his half-divine talisman. Jing Fu fell from the night sky and covered the whole courtyard by the lake, as if there were countless smaller Jing Fu hidden in it, and nothing could escape. The plum blossoms were cut, the well was cut, the wall was cut, and everything was cut when the Jing Fu fell. The eldest brother looked at the lake in the night and said with a little regret, although the youngest brother has made great progress, he hasn't been practicing talisman Taoism for long, so he hasn't become a divine talisman master yet. Yi Su shook his head and said, Divine talisman master, so what? Unless you reach the level of martial Uncle Yen Sei, if you want to defeat someone like Xia Ho with just a light talisman paper, it can only be wishful thinking. I've never thought that I could kill Xia Ho with talisman Taoism. My master probably had such an ability in his heyday, but I didn't. Naturally, I have my own ideas. Ning Ke looked at the other side of the river, which was once again swallowed by the darkness of the night, and said, Everyone says that one can't challenge someone of a higher state. No one in the world, including the senior brothers of the academy, believes that I can defeat Xia Ho. But I insist on doing it because they have all miscalculated one thing. I have never thought of defeating Xia Ho. I only want to kill him. If you don't defeat the enemy, how can you kill the enemy? A battle is only a moment, but killing a person can be a very long process. There can be many battles in it. In the countless battles before, I may not be able to defeat him, but I can make him bleed. Then, even if I still can't defeat him in the end, his blood may be drained. When his blood is drained, he will naturally die. Tonight, Xia Ho and I are not competing with strength, psyche power, or state, but to see who can drain his blood faster. He is a powerhouse of the devil's doctrine, and his defense is too terrifying. He is like a turtle. What I have to do is to constantly bleed this turtle and make sure that I won't be bitten to death by him. Ning Ke said solemnly, Thank you, Tang. I have broken the outermost layer of the turtle shell on Xia Ho's body. Then, what I have to do next is relatively simple. Sang Sang looked at him and said, We will succeed. Ning Ke said a lot today and explained a lot. If it was not Sang Sang beside him, but another audience, such as Yi Hongyu would have been extremely annoyed and would have kicked him into the ice lake under the cliff. Sang Sang was a little surprised at first, but then she understood the reason. Ning Ke did not have the slightest confidence in facing Xia Ho. Even if his expression was so calm, and his tone was so peaceful, as if he was full of confidence and everything was under control, even if he had prepared for a whole 15 years. He still did not have confidence. So he kept talking about his preparation and the reason why he would definitely win, to make himself believe that he could really succeed in the cross-state challenge and defeat the seemingly invincible and powerful enemy. Sang Sang was very worried about Ning Ke's current mental state. So she kept using a more certain tone than Ning Ke, saying, We will definitely win. When the whole world did not believe in Ning Ke, and even when Ning Ke himself was about to lose confidence, then she was the only one left who could give him the last bit of confidence. Because this was not only Ning Ke's battle, but also the battle between the two of them. Sang Sang put the big black umbrella on her thin shoulder and stretched out her right hand to tightly grasp Ning Ke's clothes. She gripped it so hard that her calloused fingers seemed to sink into his body. Then she slowly closed her eyes without batting her eyelashes. Xia Ho walked out of the lakeside courtyard and came to the lake embankment. In front of him were several willows. The berserk sea of talisman papers attacked his powerful body thousands of times. Although it didn't leave any wounds on his body, it cut his hair bun. His black hair was mixed with several stalks of silver, and it draped over his back, making him look like a demon god in a Buddhist painting. However, his tattered clothes and the broken armor tied around his waist made this demon god look very wretched. Xia Ho reached out and tore off the pieces of armor on his waist, like throwing garbage under the willow tree. Then he looked at the night sky around Yanming Lake and coughed. In the cold winter night, the temperature was so low that the lake ice was as hard as steel. But it should not make a powerhouse at the peak state of martial arts who was as hard as steel feel it. Xia Ho was surprised that there were so many talismans in the lakeside courtyard that even the wind and snow could not bear it. He was surprised that Ning Kei's ability in talisman Taoism was much stronger than the rumors. What surprised him most was that Ning Kei could use talismans from such a distance. The accident made people vigilant. He knew that he had made a mistake, but since he knew what was wrong, he could correct it. Therefore, he did not care and still looked around the winter lake in silence. The shore of Yanming Lake was covered in white snow. However, the night was too dark. There were no stars or lights. Therefore, the bright sky and the earth were dim and the snow seemed to have turned black. The night shrouded the nearby willows and the distant reeds. Whether it was the frozen lake water or the hills around the lake, they were all dark. No matter how sensitive one's perception was, one could not see anything with the naked eye. Xiaofan did not know where Ning Kei was at this time. He only knew that he must be on the shore of Yanming Lake, but he did not know whether it was the wooden bridge on the west bank, the snow forest on the east bank or the cliff on the south bank. But he was sure that if Ning Kei moved again, he would die. Ning Kei stood on the cliff, holding an iron bow in his hand. He raised the iron bow and slowly pulled the bowstring. The bowstring hummed slightly and was instantly covered by the wind and snow. There was some snow on the black iron bow, making it look colder. The iron arrow engraved with complicated talisman lines on the bowstring was aimed at the night sky on the north bank of Yanming Lake. The night clouds covered the stars, and it was dark everywhere. There were no stars, and no figure. Xiaofan could not see him, and Ning Kei naturally could not see Xiaofan. This time was different from last year when he shot Prince Longqing on the snow cliff in the wilderness. At that time, Prince Longqing was at the critical moment of breaking the realm. His cultivation state was full of vigor, as if he was burning his natal life. In Ning Kei's sense of perception, he was like a golden flower that was about to bloom. Even if he was more than 10 miles away, he clearly did not need to aim. Xiaofan, as a powerhouse at the peak state of martial arts, could merge with the willows by the lake. Even if Ning Kei entered the knowing destiny state, he could not locate Xiaofan. In this case, where was he going to shoot the primordial 13 arrows in his hand? At this moment, Sang Sang, who was under the big black umbrella, closed her eyes and frowned her thin eyebrows. She said 2 numbers. 6, 3, 3. 2, 1, 7, 7, 2. More than 2 years ago, deep in the Min Mountain in spring, an arrow came from the northern mountain road. At that time, the forest was burning. When the third assassin attacked Ning Kei, Sang Sang hid under the big black umbrella, closed her eyes, and shouted 2 words with all her strength. More than 2 years later, by the cliff of the ice lake in the cold winter, under the willows on the north bank, a strong enemy stood silently. At this time, wind and snow were dancing on the cliff, and Sang Sang shouted 2 numbers again. These numbers were coordinates that only Ning Kei and Sang Sang understood. In the past 15 years, they accompanied them to hunt in the Min Mountain. Fighting with their lives on the line had become instinctive and would not make mistakes. It was almost the same as 2 years ago, but the numbers shouted by Sang Sang tonight were much more complicated. The complexity of the number often represented the degree of accuracy. The cold and dark arrow moved slowly, looking for a target in the night snow. Then it stopped. He released the taut bowstring. The iron arrow left the bowstring and disappeared in the turbulent hole in front of the bow, and disappeared in the wind and snow. Xiaofan firmly believed that as long as Ning Kei attacked again, he would die. Ning Kei used the most powerful primordial 13 arrows. The dark iron arrow disappeared in front of the cliff a moment ago. The next moment, it suddenly appeared in front of Xiaofan. The talisman lines on the arrow were slightly bright, and the remaining snowflakes were not blown away by the wind. At this moment, the primordial 13 arrows seemed to break through the constraints of distance and time. They were even no longer affected by the surrounding environment. The cold arrow pierced through Xiaoho's close-fitting clothes. The qi of heaven and earth on the surface of his body suddenly sank. Xiaoho felt something. He reached out and grasped the air. He only had time to hold the middle part of the arrow. There were probably only a few people in the world who could hold Ning Kei's primordial 13 arrows. The iron arrow made an ear-piercing sound in the iron palm. Sparks flew everywhere, illuminating the willows by the lake. Tomorrow is the 2nd anniversary of my marriage with my leader. I only write 1 chapter. From the day after tomorrow, I will write 2 chapters a day until the end of the month. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 479. The iron arrow in Xiaoho's hand continued to move towards his chest and was about to pierce into his body. Xiaoho's eyes suddenly lit up like stars. With a roar, the sparks caused by the friction between the iron arrow and his palm were extinguished instantly. A strong wind blew on the embankment and the willows were all broken, dancing wildly in the snow. Accompanied by the terrifying impact, Xiaoho's body flew backward. His feet were like iron pillars stepping on the embankment, plowing 2 extremely deep ravines. If the Yanming Lake had not been frozen, the lake water would have flowed in. The cluster of the iron arrow pierced through the qi of heaven and earth on the surface of his body. It pierced through his clothes and skin, leaving a shallow wound from which a drop of blood slowly seeped out. Xiaoho raised his head and looked towards the southern shore of the Yanming Lake. His dark face turned pale and he began to cough. Blood flowed from the corner of his mouth. There was an empty passage above the ice lake on a snowy night. There was no snow in it. Only then did the snow fall again and was crushed into pieces by the aftershock of the arrow. This was the art of archery. The other end of the arrow was on the cliff on the southern shore of the Yanming Lake. Xiaoho finally confirmed Ning Kei's position. He looked over there expressionlessly and released a strong aura from his body. Snow and dust danced wildly and formed a circle among the swaying willows. Then, the ground where his feet stood suddenly sank, forming a perfect circle of about 10 feet. Borrowing the terrifying counterforce, his body disappeared from the lake embankment, leaving only the lingering wind. A few pieces of snow fell. Xiaoho left the embankment and began to run towards the southern shore of the lake. His feet stepped heavily on the surface of the lake. The ice of the Yanming Lake was extremely solid. Even with the impact of his body in high speed, it still did not break. However, every time he stepped, a few inconspicuous cracks would appear. Beneath the solid lake ice was the water. Feeling the mountain-like weight on the ice, it began to shake uneasily, making a dull and strange sound. It was as if drumsticks were beating heavily on a war drum, producing a dull thumping sound. This winter lake was his war drum. The frequency at which he struck the war drum was not high, but every strike was powerful. Xiaoho's running pace was not fast, but every step he took seemed to cross mountains and rivers. In the blink of an eye, his figure had already appeared on the frozen Yanming Lake. If someone could see through the darkness of the night, perhaps they would be able to see the afterimage on the lake. An expert at the peak of the martial Tao possessed absolute power. When he transformed his power into speed, it was difficult to describe the terrifying degree with words or comparison. The night wind on the snow lake was certainly not as fast as this, and neither was the falling snow. Even if Ning Kei's talisman arrows were faster, there was no way he could hit such a fast target. On the battlefield, this was a very simple principle. Both Xiaoho and Ning Kei had been through hundreds of battles, so they knew this very well. Xiaoho had been vigilantly waiting for the legendary primordial 13 arrows ever since he knew that Ning Kei was hostile to him. He thought for a long time and finally came to a conclusion. As long as he ran, the primordial 13 arrows would not pose any threat to him. His sturdy military boots cracked the ice on the lake and he arrived at the snowy lake. There were withered lotuses frozen in the water. They had long died and accumulated snow, looking very miserable. Just as Xiaofan stepped on a withered lotus, the other withered lotuses next to it trembled, as if they had regained some kind of vitality. Then, there was a loud bang. The ice on the winter lake cracked, the withered lotuses all collapsed, the fire burst, and the airwaves rolled wildly. Xiaofan's mountain-like body was actually shaken high up into the air. Among the fire and airwaves, there were countless shrill whistles and hissing sounds. The withered lotuses that were not shaken by the explosion seemed to have been cut by a sharp blade. They were all broken and turned into countless pieces. Xiaofan landed heavily on the snow lake, splashing snowflakes. His knees were slightly bent and his military boots were torn, but his body was strong enough to maintain balance and did not fall. What followed him to the ground were countless extremely sharp and hard iron shards. The high-speed iron shards whistled and slashed the withered lotuses, then fell on the ice like rain. The sharp iron shards stuck to his body. The chi of heaven and earth on the surface of his body, at the most dangerous moment, blocked most of the power of the explosion and the cutting of the sharp iron shards. But there were still dozens of sharp iron shards that wedged into his body. Many wounds appeared on Xiaofan's hard skin, and blood began to flow. At this moment, the second iron arrow arrived. It was sudden and without warning. Xiaofan looked at the snow floating on the winter lake and timidly avoided it. He poured his qi into his right arm and waved it expressionlessly. This seemingly simple wave caused the night wind to blow on the snow lake and the ice to roll wildly. There was a sharp crack. A clear cut appeared on his right arm. The iron arrow was shaken and brushed past his body into the snow lake. With a boom, a dark and gloomy hole appeared on the extremely hard lake ice. Xiaofan suddenly looked up and stared in the direction of the south bank. Then, he began to run again. He confirmed that he had underestimated Ning Kei's means. But he could no longer retreat. He had to close the distance between him and Ning Quebec. Therefore, no matter how many tricks were hidden in this winter lake, or how many explosions like the one before were hidden in the withered lotus field, he had to rush over. He continued to run into the lotus field. Then, the second explosion occurred. The primordial 13 arrows could ignore the distance, but not the moving speed of the target. Ning Kei also knew this. Moreover, Xiaofan's devil's doctrine was extremely powerful. His physical strength was not comparable to Prince Long Qing's. Therefore, he never expected to kill Xiaofan with the primordial 13 arrows alone. Fortunately, there was a lotus field in Yanming Lake. In late spring, Ning Kei bought all the houses by the Yanming Lake and turned it into a lake in his backyard. He planted many lotus flowers in the lake. In midsummer, he and Sang boated on the lake and walked through the dense lotus field. They enjoyed the lake, the wind, the stars, and the lotus seeds. Then, they threw many small iron kettles into the lotus field. In winter, Yanming Lake was frozen. The surface of the ice was thick, and the lotus field had long withered. The small iron kettles that had sunk deep in the mud of the lotus field began to wake up. With the awakening of the small iron kettles, explosions sounded one after another on the snow lake. The blazing flames and terrifying waves of air shook the snow on the surface of the lake into the air. Countless sharp and hard pieces of metal whistled through the wind and snow. Many black holes appeared on the hard layer of ice on the lake. Between the whistling wind and the iron pieces, Xiaofan was already covered in blood. What was more terrifying was that every time he slowed down because of the explosion, Sang, who was holding the big black umbrella on the cliff of the south bank, would report his position. Then, Ning Kei would shoot an arrow. The next moment, the terrifying and cold iron arrow would arrive in front of Xiaofan. The small iron kettles were flowers. Ning Ke and Sang Sang had planted many lotuses in this winter lake, and the number of kettles they threw would be the same number of flowers on the lake tonight. The iron arrows were thorns. Ning Ke had 13 arrows in his arrow box. Then, he would definitely take advantage of the time when the snow lake was blooming to shoot all of them. I have reported to everyone that there are some things that I will not write today. I will try to write more tomorrow. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 480. The winter lake should have been quiet and dark under the night snow. However, there was a strong gust of wind on the surface of the lake tonight, accompanied by terrifying explosions and sparks. Iron lotuses blossomed in the frozen lotus field. The thick snow on the surface of the lake was thrown up by an invisible force and sprinkled into the dark night sky. The thick layer of ice collapsed and exploded. The ink-like cold lake water kept slapping against the black hole, stirring up snow-like waves and then dissipating into the real snow. In the withered lotus field, Xiaofan was once again shaken by the airwave. Accompanied by the sharp sound of iron shrapnel, his mountain-like body broke through the wind and seemed to be thrown above the night clouds. On the cliff of the south bank of Yanming Lake, Sang Sang held the big black umbrella tightly in one hand and Ning Ke's clothes in the other. She lowered her head and closed her eyes. She did not look at the chaotic scene on the lake in front of the cliff, but she seemed to be able to clearly capture the position of everything. She whispered 2 numbers again. Hearing the 2 numbers, Ning Ke did not hesitate to draw his bow and shoot at the distant night clouds above. It was pitch black and he could not see clearly what was there, but he knew that Xiaofan was there. The sky was covered in a blizzard. It was pitch black and the arrow could not be seen. Only the sharp whistling of the primordial 13 arrows could be heard. When people heard the whistling of the arrows, it was already the next moment. The night clouds above Yanming Lake suddenly fluctuated and the chi of heaven and earth became chaotic. It was as if there was an explosion of thunder in the dark clouds, and the dim wisps of clouds fled in all directions. The night clouds suddenly broke and blood splashed. Xiaofan fell from the sky. This time, he could no longer maintain his balance and smashed heavily on the ice, causing a few deep cracks to appear on the ice. A cold and dark iron arrow pierced deeply through his left arm. Because of anger and pain, Xiaofan's eyes seemed to be burning. He was like an injured beast king. He grabbed the tail of the iron arrow and pulled it out from his upper arm. He continued to run towards the south bank. He only had time to take 3 steps forward. At the bottom of the lotus field, there was another powerful explosion in the mud. The layer of ice under his feet suddenly cracked, almost swallowing his body into the dark and cold lake water. What followed were the heat waves, flames, and the extremely sinister and terrifying sharp iron pieces. When the waves in the lake passed through the ice and reached the feet of the military boots, Xiaofan made the most timely response with the ability of a powerhouse at the peak of martial arts. With a heavy step, he left the frozen surface of the lake and flew into the air. Then, he raised his fists in front of him as fast as lightning. Under the night snow, the main hall was brightly lit and silent. Naturally, there were no cicadas chirping. Everyone knew what was happening in Chang'an, so everyone inside and outside the main hall had a strange look on their faces. The guards held the cold hilts of their swords and stood guard outside the hall. The eunuchs and palace maids lowered their heads and walked slowly, making sure that when their feet touched the ground, there would be no sound. The Tang Emperor did not wear his regular clothes tonight. Instead, he wore a bright yellow dragon robe. He leaned on the soft couch and read a scroll in his hand, but no one knew if he could focus on it. The Empress sat on the chair beside the couch. Her gentle and elegant face was expressionless today. One could vaguely see worry and anger in the depths of her eyes. The nation master of Tang, Li Qingshan, and the emperor's younger brother, Master Huang Yang, sat opposite each other in front of the couch. Today, many powerhouses gathered in Chang'an, so the two most powerful and trustworthy sublime people of the imperial court had to be in the palace. The emperor slowly put down the scroll in his hand and looked at the falling snow outside the hall. He looked in the direction of Yanming Lake in the south and frowned slightly. No one knew what he was thinking about. Although Xiaofan was the empress' elder brother, from an emotional point of view, His Majesty hoped that Ning Ke could win. Because His Majesty had always regarded himself as a student of the headmaster of academy, then in his eyes, Ning Ke was his younger brother. What a majestic aura! Li Qingshan felt the fluctuation of the qi of heaven and earth from Yanming Lake and said, Ning Ke's talisman arrow is really terrifying. The empress suddenly raised her head and looked at the emperor. She said in a trembling voice, gathering the wisdom of the academy's back mountain and the power of the Tang Empire to create such a talisman arrow. Is this fair? The emperor was silent. He did not want to make his wife more upset. Master Huang Yang, who had been silent, suddenly said calmly, It's fair. It's just that Ning Ke has prepared for a longer time. He has prepared for 15 years. After saying this, he and Li Qingshan left their seats and walked out into the snow outside the hall, leaving the quiet and complicated palace to the emperor and the empress. There was a pavilion at the back of the main hall, and an ancient bell hung in the pavilion. There was a thick layer of snow on the eaves of the pavilion, and a light layer of snow on the ancient bell. Li Qingshan and Huang Yang walked into the pavilion and stood beside the ancient bell. Li Qingshan looked to the south and said with a deep frown, It's still not enough. Monk Huang Yang said, I didn't expect that you also hoped that Ning Ke would win. Li Qingshan said, People's emotions are uncontrollable. Although Xiaofan is an elder of our Haotian Taoism, Ning Ke is my senior brother's only successor. Then he said with slight sadness, He has prepared for 15 years, but it's still not enough. Monk Huang Yang reached out his palm and gently wiped the snow on the ancient bell. He said, When Ning Ke entered Talisman Taoism, he once came to the Wanyan Tower to ask me. I also hoped that he could win, but I had my own thoughts. If the one who prepared for a longer time would win, then what's the point of cultivation? The blizzard abruptly stopped, and the airwaves caused by the explosion gradually subsided. The night wind also became much gentler. Yanming Lake was quiet in the middle of the night. The night clouds on the lake gradually parted, revealing a gap. A few stars popped out of the gap and looked curiously at the ground, trying to see what had happened. Most of the night sky was still covered by thick black clouds. The few stars disappeared as soon as they appeared, but some light shone down, making things slightly visible. It was a mess on the ice surface of the snow lake. The withered lotus had long been broken into powder, and dozens of faint black holes appeared in the lotus field. It was chilling to see. A burly man knelt on one knee on the ice in front of those black holes. His clothes were in tatters, and it was unknown if there were dozens or hundreds of pieces of metal. Blood continuously flowed from his body, finally flowing onto the snow on the surface of the lake, dyeing the snow around his knees dark red. The red on the winter night was actually more like black. The place where the burly man knelt was only a few hundred feet away from the south bank of Yanming Lake. Ning Ke stood on the cliff by the lake and stared at the lake. In order to fight and shoot arrows, he wore a black academy uniform. The sleeves and trousers were tied tightly by sangsang with cloth ropes. At this moment, his body, especially his right arm, was trembling violently, so the black academy uniform flapped in the lake wind. Using the primordial 13 arrows consumed a lot of physical strength and psyche power. Ning Ke could only shoot a few arrows in the past. Now that he had successfully cultivated the Great Spirit, it was still a great burden for him to shoot all 13 iron arrows in the quiver. In addition to the hundreds of talismans in the lakeside house and the small iron kettle in the mud at the bottom of the lake, he had used all his means. At this moment, the psyche power in his sense of perception was almost exhausted. His eyes were abnormally bright, and his face was abnormally pale and haggard. His right arm was extremely weak, and his right shoulder felt as if it was being torn apart. He was so weak that he could fall at any time. But he did not fall. He waited for Xiaofan to fall first on the lake. Xiaofan knelt on one knee on the snow lake. In the end, he did not manage to block Ning Kei's last primordial 13 arrow. The cold and dark iron arrow directly pierced through his calf bone. If it was an ordinary cultivator who was shot by this iron arrow, his leg would definitely be broken. Xiaofan was not an ordinary cultivator. His leg was not broken, and the iron arrow did not even pierce through his leg. However, this caused him more serious injuries and more pain. Xiaofan reached out his right hand to hold the iron arrow in his calf. He wanted to pull the arrow out, but his hands were trembling so badly that he did not succeed. He added his left hand with a blank expression. His two iron hands suddenly exerted force, and the hard iron arrow was actually broken in the middle. This action would definitely bring great pain. Xiaoho's iron eyebrows twitched violently. His lips, which looked like they were smeared with rouge, opened and let out a shrill howl. The shrill and terrifying howl reverberated on the quiet snow lake. It shook the ice and snow, and even the willows by the shore danced. Xiaoho's knees gradually straightened and he stood up. At this moment, he was covered in blood and looked extremely miserable. However, when he stood on the snow lake, he was extremely domineering, like an indestructible mountain. He was more like the blood flag outside the courtyard on the north shore of Yanming Lake. That blood flag whistled and danced in the cold wind, but it seemed as if it would never fall. Xiaoho looked at the cliff on the south cliff. His pale face was devoid of any expression, and his trembling voice was clearly filled with pain. However, his words were still filled with an insufferably arrogant aura. Ning Kei, is that all? There's more today. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 481. Is this all you've got? Do you think you can kill me like this? I haven't even used my most powerful move. Don't tell me you can't do it. A shrill howl reverberated across the snow lake. Xiaoho walked towards the southern shore of Yanming Lake in the night. Because of his leg injury, he walked very slowly. His voice trembled a little, but his footsteps were still as steady as ever. His aura was still as strong as ever, unparalleled in the world. Ning Kei, who was standing on the edge of the cliff, looked at Xiaoho who was walking slowly on the ice surface of the lake. His face was expressionless, but he felt a little strange. He felt the coldness brought by the wind and snow. The primordial 13 arrows in the arrow box had been shot out. The hundreds of fu papers that he had accumulated over the past 2 years had turned into a yellow waterfall and colorful storm in the house on the north bank. The small iron kettles in the mud at the bottom of the lake had all exploded. He seemed to have used his most powerful move, but he still could not kill Xiaoho. He could not even stop Xiaoho from walking slowly toward the south bank. Was this the power of a powerhouse at the peak of martial arts? The snowflakes falling on the city wall had become much sparser. Eldest brother looked in the direction of Yanming Lake. His clean eyes could not hide his worried expression. The old cotton-padded jacket on him trembled slightly, as if it was hesitating to float up. Yisu's expression was slightly stern. He did not expect that the battle on the winter lake would present such a situation. From the beginning to the present, Xiaoho had been completely restrained and had suffered such heavy injuries. I have to admit that Ning Ke has given me a lot of surprises. The last disciple of the headmaster of academy is indeed not an ordinary person. But it is a pity that he will die tonight. He looked at eldest brother and said, unless you make a move. Eldest senior brother understood the meaning of this sentence. Tonight, all the powerhouses in the world had gathered in Chang'an City. Only he and Jun Mo from the academy were here to create a fair environment for Ning Quebec. Jun Mo was responsible for watching the Tang military, while he was responsible for watching the peerless genius of Haotian Taoism. Correspondingly, he and Jun Mo were also being watched by the other party. If he made a move, then Yi Su would definitely make a move. Eldest brother's expression gradually became gentle and calm as if he had thought of something. Teacher often asks me to learn from junior brother, and I've been thinking about what I should learn. Now that I think about it, it's to learn from his attitude when he's in trouble. He looked in the direction of Yanming Lake and said, the most admirable thing about youngest brother is himself. He is his own sky and has no limits. When everyone in the world thinks that he can't do it, he can always take another step forward and climb another step on the stone steps. He was like this when he entered the academy, when he entered the old academy, and when he climbed the mountain path to the second floor. How could there be an accident tonight? There were many torches lit outside the Yulin Royal Guards barracks, illuminating the surroundings. The snow bridge outside the barracks looked like a jade belt, and the man wearing a tall crown on the snow bridge looked like an immortal on the jade belt. As the wind and snow drifted, time continued to pass. From day to night, it was unknown how much time had passed, but the confrontation on the snowy bridge continued. The second brother of the academy, Jun Mo, had been sitting on the snow bridge. The Defender General of the state, Su Shi, and the powerful Yulin Royal Guards had been staying under the snow bridge. General Su Shi leaned against the railing under the snow bridge and looked at second brother, who was sitting cross-legged on the snow bridge. He coughed painfully and said, Ning Ke's challenge to Xia Ho, in my opinion, is a challenge to the dignity of the Tang military, so I want to stop this battle from happening. Second brother slowly raised his head and looked at the leader of the Tang military. The thin snow covering his eyebrows fell, and he said, since the battle has begun, there's no need for words. Yes, there's no need for words. Su Shi raised his eyebrows and looked at second brother angrily, so you want Ning Ke to die? Second brother said, since the battle has begun, there will be life and death. As soldiers of the Tang Empire, don't you understand this simple truth? After a short pause, he said coldly, moreover, Xia Ho is not a great figure. Who dares to say that my youngest brother will definitely lose? In the eyes of Mr. Second of the Academy, Xia Ho, the general of the Tang Empire, was indeed not a terrifying opponent. But now it was Ning Ke who was fighting against Xia Ho. Su Shi thought so and then said indifferently, there are no miracles in the world. Second brother looked at him and said seriously, the Academy is a place to create miracles. If I can't kill this person after 15 years of preparation, then the rest can only depend on destiny. But the teacher said that there is no destiny in the world. Ning Ke thought so while standing on the cliff. He looked up at the sky and then looked down at the person walking on the snow lake. He slowly raised his eyebrows and asked, can we really succeed? After the arrow box was empty, Sang Sang opened her eyes. She held the big black umbrella and looked at Ning Ke's eyes. She nodded very hard and said, because we have to succeed. Ning Ke laughed and thought that was true. No matter whether destiny existed or not, no matter whether he could succeed or not, he had to succeed. Ning Ke stood up from the snow and wiped the blood from the corner of his lips. He looked at the dark stick-like object in Xia Ho's hand, and a strong sense of alarm rose in his heart. Xia Ho looked at him and his eyes gradually narrowed. He seemed to have discovered something very strange. Ning Ke asked, what is this? Xia Ho said, a spear. Only the flagpole was left of the blood-colored military flag. The flagpole was the spear. Let me first say that tomorrow's chapter is called Open Spear. P.S. A friend has written a Xianxia book called The Brave General. The book number is 2093193. It has already exceeded 2 million words and is about to reach 2,000 subscriptions. It is fighting to be published. If you are interested in Xianxia books, you may want to take a look. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Xiao thought that it was light, or rather, he hoped that there would be light in the future, so he named this iron spear, Open Spear. With the spear and the open in his hand, Xiao dared to look directly at Ming Zong spying in the dark. Not to mention the ordinary saber in Ning Kei's hand. When the crimson flag was torn to shreds, the flagpole turned into a spear and flew into the night clouds. Eldest brother, who was on the city wall, noticed it. He subconsciously took a step forward and placed his hands on the top of the city wall. He did not feel the cold snow on the top of the wall and looked in the direction of Yanming Lake with a worried expression. One could imagine the power of Xiao's spear, which could make the eldest brother of the academy so solemn and worried, and how much of an impact it would have on the hearts of the spectators tonight. The eldest brother murmured, "I did not expect General Xiao to have hidden such a move in the end. The speed, strength, and momentum of this spear can be said to be perfect." Yi Su said, "I remember Master once said that when he led Xiao into the Tao sect, he once tried to make him break away from the Devil's Doctrine's cultivation method and switch to Tao law. I didn't expect Xiao to actually switch to Tao law and cultivate this spear to such a level. It is really incredible." The eldest brother was slightly moved and said, "So it was taught by the Abbey Dean. No wonder it is so domineering." "It is not domineering, it is open and aboveboard." Yi Su said, "If Xiao could cultivate the open spear to absolute light, he would probably be able to compete with Liu Bai at his peak." The eldest brother shook his head and said, "Let's not talk about General Xiao's injury and just talk about the state of the open spear. It is still a distance away from Mr. Liu Bai's sword style." Yi Su said, "The distance is the distance from Liu Bai, but it is not something that Ning Kei can handle." The eldest brother was silent. After withstanding the extremely domineering open spear, Ning Kei had suffered a terrible impact and his internal injuries were gradually showing. He needed time to recover, so he was willing to say a few more words. Although Xiao was also seriously injured, he should have chosen to launch a thunderous attack and smash Ning Kei into meat paste before his blood ran dry. However, he did not know why he gave Ning Kei time to say a few words. Because he had some doubts in his heart, so he was vigilant. For the battle on the snow lake tonight, Ning Kei had prepared for 15 years. Xiao did not have a long time to prepare, but he had decades of experience on the bloody battlefield. He was one of the 4 great generals of the Tang Empire. People were often attracted by his ruthless and cold-blooded side and forgot his talent in military affairs. In fact, his commanding ability on the battlefield was not weaker than his powerful strength. He knew that the little handmaiden had a special relationship with Ning Kei, and he also knew that the little handmaiden was the successor of Wei Guangming. Sangsang's identity and origin had always made Xiao feel a little strange and vigilant. So he decided to kill her first. This decision was still based on the art of war. The art of war was not sinister or complicated. Instead, it was simple and upright, just like the temperament of the iron spear itself. Xiao wanted to clearly tell Ning Kei that he wanted to kill Sangsang. He wanted Ning Kei to turn back to save her, and then die. Sangsang was Ning Kei's life. If someone dared to use Sangsang to threaten him, he would definitely kill the other party at all costs, just like how he had shot Long Qing in the wilderness. And for ordinary people, when such a thin and weak girl, who was more precious than life, was threatened by death, they would immediately turn back to save her, disregarding their own lives. But Ning Ke did not do so. When he sensed the majestic and domineering iron spear piercing the cliff, he did not turn back. Instead, he gripped the hilt of his knife tightly and stepped heavily on the ice with his right foot. His body instantly flew more than 100 feet above the snow lake. With a flick of his wrist, he raised the sharp padao and rushed toward Xiaofan. His speed was very shocking. The cold wind on the snow lake blew at his black academy uniform, making the sleeves of his clothes flutter, like the night sky that was about to disperse. Xiaofan raised his eyebrows slightly, somewhat puzzled. He stretched out his iron-like right hand and grasped the air in the night wind. The iron spear pierced through the air and instantly came to the cliff on the south bank of Yanming Lake. It stabbed toward Sang Sang. Because of the intense friction with the air, the dark body of the spear glowed with a bright luster. Compared to Sang Sang's thin and short body, it looked extraordinarily thick and terrifying. The wind of the spear wrapped around the remaining snow on the cliff and blew against her face, causing her cheeks to hurt. Her slightly yellow hair, which had been cut short, fell backwards like water grass in a steep stream. She knew that Ning Ke would not turn back to save her, because he could not save her in time. Because Ning Ke believed that she could save her, and because at this moment, she had to save herself. Although Sang Sang was the successor of the divine priest of light and had learned divine skills from the old man, and had verified with the Tao addict, Yi Hongyu, these days, she had never participated in a battle between cultivators. She did not know how to fight and did not know how to save herself. Relying on her instinct, she crouched down like an injured little beast, just like when she was in a life and death situation in Min Mountain many years ago. The tip of the spear shone brightly. After a loud and clear sound, Ning Ke flew backwards like an injured bird and fell heavily on the snow lake again. The dark iron spear trembled at an extremely high frequency in Xiaofan's hand, unable to calm down for a long time. It emitted a low buzzing sound that chilled one's heart. Every time the iron spear and the padao collided, it was simple and unadorned, full of strength. It seemed simple and boring, but in reality, it contained the power to split mountains and split lakes. Ning Ke stood up, feeling as if his wrist had been broken. His face was as pale as snow. Although Xiaofan had been severely injured by his talisman arrow, he was still far from his opponent in terms of strength and the density of his qi. There was no way to make up for or close the gap. Xiaofan's simple spear had broken Ning Ke's long-planned and life-risking attack. There should be no reason for him to be dissatisfied, but his brows were deeply furrowed. Because this spear had still not pierced Ning Ke's body. Just at that moment, when the open spear was like the blazing sun and was about to tear apart the darkness on Ning Ke's body, the padao in Ning Ke's hand had mysteriously flipped out of nowhere and hit the tip of the spear. Then, his body had borrowed the momentum to fly backwards, but he had not been thrown out by the spear tip. Xiaofan narrowed his eyes and looked at Ning Quebec. He said, "In the spring, when you secluded yourself in the cliff cave of the Academy's back mountain, you were indeed not cultivating both talisman and martial arts. Instead, you have joined the devil." Ning Ke spat a mouthful of blood-stained saliva into the snow in front of him and did not reply. Previously, Xiaofan had figured out half of the answer. The answer was that Ning Ke had joined the devil. Otherwise, if he was an ordinary cultivator, he would not have been able to withstand the great power carried by the iron spear. But that was only half of the answer. Xiaofan had attacked Ning Ke 3 times tonight, and every spear was a work of great spirit. He believed that even the masters of the devil's doctrine back then could not have withstood it. Ning Ke should have died, but he was still alive. Every time at the most critical moment, when the shadow of death from the spear tip was about to cover his body, he could always react in advance, and it was the most correct response. Xiao was suddenly alarmed. Even if Ning Ke joined the devil, it could not explain how he could do this, because this meant that he had the deepest understanding of the surrounding qi of heaven and earth. In other words, Ning Ke seemed to have the fighting consciousness of the knowing destiny state tonight. The snow on the city wall gradually stopped, but it seemed colder than before. Eldest brother and Yi Su looked in the direction of Yanming Lake, and the breath they exhaled permeated the surroundings like fog. Yi Su did not expect that Ning Ke could actually withstand Xiao's open spear. Although he was extremely embarrassed, he did not die after all. This made him puzzled, and even a little shocked. Although Xiao's open spear was dark and left no trace in the night clouds, it was a righteous one. It used speed, strength, and momentum to suppress the opponent, forcing the opponent to fight to the death. With Ning Ke's current level of consciousness, he could not even capture the movement of the open spear, let alone predict the opponent's movements. He could only take it head-on. Moreover, his cultivation state was only in the see-through state, and he did not have the ability to use the qi of heaven and earth as a means of attack. So when Xiao used the first spear, he should have already died. Xiao's open spear naturally could not stab you, Mr. First. Yi Su glanced at eldest brother and continued, if it was Liu Bai, he would definitely hold his sword hilt upside down and use the surging yellow waves to attack and kill him. If it was me facing the iron spear, would probably condense my sword style into an iron chain and try to bind the spear. But I don't understand how Ning Ke could avoid his spear. Eldest brother thought for a while and shook his head, saying, I also don't know how youngest brother did it. Yi Su closed his eyes and listened attentively to the faint sound of the spear and the knife clashing on the distant snow lake. He suddenly thought of a possibility. After a while, he opened his eyes and said with a frown, even so, it can't be explained. Eldest brother asked, is that so? Yi Su said expressionlessly, you know what I mean. Eldest brother said, the academy will not admit it. Yi Su said coldly, not admitting it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Eldest brother said slowly, if there is no evidence, it will only cause trouble. Yi Su took a deep breath and suddenly said something that made no sense, the headmaster of the academy will leave one day. Eldest senior brother said without hesitation. This was almost the same as what Ning Ke had said to Yi Hongyu. I don't think the headmaster will leave before us. After inheriting youngest uncle's mantle in the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine, the Great Spirit had been constantly changing Ning Ke's body. His body was becoming stronger and stronger, and his power was increasing. Correspondingly, his body movements and speed were also becoming faster and faster. But Xiao was a powerhouse of the previous generation of the Devil's Doctrine. His body had been nourished by the genuine qi for many years, so both his power and speed were far above Ning Ke's. That was why he could block Xiao's open spear. Ning Ke did not know that Xiao's last move was actually a Taoist skill, nor did he expect that Xiao would have his own natal item. Xiao said, no matter what teacher taught you, you will still die tonight. Ning Ke said, I thought that I was the only one in the world who was better at talking than fighting. Xiao squinted and said, then let's do it. Please take another spear from me. The cold voice gradually faded away. Xiao's burly body seemed to become a real mountain. A deep crack suddenly appeared on the solid lake ice under his feet, and the lake water could be faintly seen. The snow lake finally began to ripple. The distance between the two people on the surface of the lake shrank rapidly. Xiao held the iron spear and stabbed it straight. Ning Ke shook his wrist and chopped down with his padao. The iron spear and the padao met again. Ning Ke frowned as he felt the terrifying power coming from the hilt of the padao. Without any hesitation, he released his psyche power and the drop of crystal liquid in his body began to spin at a high speed. The great spirit that he had cultivated in the cliff cave at the back of the academy for several months spurted out in an almost presumptuous manner. The padao in his hands suddenly shone brightly. Countless golden rays of light splashed out from the dark blade, like the golden light reflected by the city wall of Chang'an at dusk. It was also like the sudden appearance of the sun. In an instant, the dark Yanming lake was as bright as day. After the golden and holy light left the padao, it passed through the cold air and turned into a golden sand-like object, hitting Xia Ho's face hard. For thousands of years, Taoism and the Devil's Doctrine had always been at odds. The West Hill Divine Palace's divine skill was undoubtedly one of the nemeses of the Devil's Doctrine. After Yi Hongyu understood the divine skill, she was seen as the natural successor of the judicial department who was responsible for hunting down the remnants of the Devil's Doctrine. The powerhouses of the Devil's Doctrine were most afraid of the holy Haotian divine light. Even the youngest uncle of the academy had used the divine light to imprison people like Master Lotus. The divine skill was a gift from Haotian to Haotian Taoism. It was also a punishment for the Devil's Doctrine. Those golden rays ignored the strong bodies and vigorous qi of the Devil's Doctrine cultivators and directly affected the flow of qi in their bodies. They could even directly melt the crystal walls of their meridians. In the Battle of the Winter Lake tonight, Xia Ho had saved his most powerful move for last. He swept his iron spear in all directions, and Ning Ke had also saved his Taoism divine skill for this moment. In the blazing Haotian divine light, Xia Ho's cheeks seemed to be so pale that they were about to become transparent. His eyes seemed to be really burning. His eyelashes fell off one by one in the divine light, then turned into charcoal, then into ashes, and finally into nothingness. A touch of fear flashed through his eyes, followed by a mocking smile. Looking at Ning Ke outside the divine light, Xia Ho laughed wildly and almost roared, "You think I don't know that you know the divine skill? But your divine skill is fake. This is still the Great Spirit. How can candlelight turn into sunlight? Fake is fake, it will never become real. You are not Koharan, what can you do to me?" An extremely vigorous Jinqi gushed out from his body, which was as tall and sturdy as a mountain. With a hissing sound, the surrounding snow was shaken off the surface of the lake and floated into the night sky. Xia Ho stood in the floating snow, holding the spear with one hand and pressing it down. He was like a god looking down from above the clouds, unstoppable. Ning Ke's knees were slightly bent and his face was pale. The ice under his feet made a creaking sound, as if it was about to break. Xia Ho turned his right palm over and hit Ning Ke's head like a small mountain. He said with an indifferent expression, "Die." Xia Ho was seriously injured tonight, and his strength was less than 20 to 30% of his peak. But he was a powerhouse at the peak of martial arts after all. Even with this remaining strength, he was still extremely powerful. With Ning Ke's current strength, it was already an extremely shocking scene to be able to withstand Xia Ho's spear in the open. His entire mind and all the Great Spirit were focused on the padao, and he had no spare energy to deal with the palm that was like a small mountain hitting his head. Even if he did, it would be too late. However, at this moment, Xia Ho let out an extremely shrill scream, retracted his palm and retreated quickly. Blood spurted out from his lower abdomen. He split the ice and snow along the way and retreated 2,000 feet in a flash. The blood that spurted out dragged a long line of blood on the snow lake. Just at that moment, Ning Ke retracted his knife in an extremely unreasonable manner. At that time, Xia Ho's palm was only half a foot away from his head. At that time, the iron spear in Xia Ho's hand was no longer blocked by the padao and was about to go down. He stabbed his knife deep into Xia Ho's lower abdomen. When he pulled out his knife, Xia Ho's palm was still half a foot away from his head. The iron spear in Xia Ho's hand did not move at all, as if it was suspended in the air. Ning Kai retracted his knife and once again blocked in front of the iron spear. Only then did Xiao react. So he retracted his palm and retreated quickly. He retreated across half of the snow lake. Even lightning could not describe the speed of Ning Kai's knife. It was a kind of momentum that surpassed the sense of speed. It was like a torrential turbid wave falling from the sky. The speed was not necessarily fast, but the momentum made everyone who saw it feel that they could not stop it from happening. On the snow lake in the distance, Xiao covered his bleeding abdomen and asked in shock and anger, "What knife is this?" Ning Kai looked at him and said, "You know that I know divine skills, but do you know that I know swordsmanship?" What he used previously was not knife skills, but sword style. It was the sword style of the world's most powerful sage of sword, Liu Bai. On the cold city wall, Yi Su looked in the direction of Yanming Lake and felt the unfamiliar but sharp sword style that he would never mistake. He subconsciously scattered the snow on the wall in front of him and said in disbelief, "A turbid river falling from the sky. How could it be Liu Bai's sword style?" He suddenly turned around and looked at eldest brother in shock. He said, "Ning Kai already knows enough things. He actually learned Liu Bai's sword. Who taught him? Could it be the academy?" Eldest brother answered honestly, "Although youngest brother has learned Haoran sword, the Dai sword was not taught by the academy." Yi Su frowned and asked, "Then who taught him?" Eldest brother hesitated for a moment and said, "Your sister. I worked very hard to write it here. See you all tomorrow. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation." Chapter 484. Ning Kai suddenly turned around. He held the hilt in his right hand and the other end of the blade in his left hand. He stood in front of him with the Great Spirit sword, trying to block Xiao's spear. There was a crisp crack. Ning Kai's left wrist was broken, and the back of the blade fell heavily on his shoulder. He shouldered it again. Xiao's iron spear moved forward again. There was another crisp cracking sound. There was a sharp pain in Ning Kai's left shoulder, and he could no longer withstand the huge force coming from the blade. He knelt on one knee, and his knee smashed several cracks on the hard ice. His face suddenly turned pale. He was in great pain, so his face was very, very white. But for some reason, there was no shadow of death in his eyes. Instead, they were very, very bright. With a cry of pain like that of a wild beast, Ning Kai turned the pain into an unimaginable instantaneous strength. He forcefully turned his right wrist, clenched his injured left hand into a fist, and hit the back of the blade heavily. Just these two simple movements made the heavy padao in his hand seem to have gained some sort of life in an instant. Like a nimble snake, it rolled up along Xiao's iron spear, creating a series of knife sparks. Instead, it pushed Xiao's iron spear downwards. The drop of crystal liquid condensed from the Great Spirit Qi in his abdomen suddenly exploded. That drop of liquid evaporated instantly and turned into nothingness. Those wisps of steam flowed along his meridians and poured into every part of his body. All the Great Spirit in his body burst out in the shortest time possible. The blazing Haotian's divine light once again spurted out from the blade, making his figure seem even more burly and insufferably arrogant than Xiao who was in front of the blade. The divine light shone on Xiao's thin and strange face, illuminating his eyes, and even the trace of indifference and mockery in his eyes was clearly illuminated. Xiao knew that this was Ning Kai's desperate attack. But he was not afraid. Just as he had said before, Ning Kai was not Haoran. No matter how his great spirit imitated Haotian's divine light, it could not be the real Haotian's divine light. He stared at Ning Kai's pale cheeks and shouted coldly, "Liu Bai's sword style is not Liu Bai's sword after all. No matter how many things you know, they are still other things. The shout reverberated on the cold snow lake, shaking the divine light on Ning Kei's blade like a torch in the wind. The iron spear suddenly rose a few inches, and the padao retreated a few inches. You can't stab me again, and you can't hurt me again. Xiao stared into Ning Kei's eyes and said coldly and disdainfully, as a disciple of the academy, you actually joined the devil and refused to cultivate your natal item. You don't even know what your heart is, so what's the point of not dying? With that said, the divine light on the blade shook even more violently. It was like a candle in the wind, about to be extinguished at any moment. Ning Kei's face was pale, and he spat out a mouthful of blood into the divine flame. The blood turned into steam with a sizzling sound, but his eyes were still so calm. Then he said two words that no one had expected. Thank you. Ning Kei was very clear about how powerful Xiao was, and how difficult it was for him, who was in the see-through state, to complete a challenge that was rarely seen in the world. So he had made a lot of plans. These plans spanned a period of 15 years, and were finally finalized when he left the House of Red Sleeves during the day and smelled the mutton soup in the streets of Chang'an. These plans were aimed at Xiao's powerful strength and the hidden tricks this powerhouse might have, and then tried to find a chance to kill him. In tonight's battle on the Snow Lake, some of these plans played an important role, such as the Storm of Talismans, the Iron Arrows and the Iron Kettles. But some were useless. For example, when he fell from the night sky, it looked miserable, but actually he wanted to lure Xiao into the dark and cold lake bottom to kill him. According to the information provided by Zhuo'er years ago, Xiao was very afraid of water. But the actual situation was that Xiao became more and more powerful and terrifying at the bottom of the lake. Ning Kei did not find a chance to use some of the plans in the battle, and some of the plans were only half used. From the very beginning, he had been looking for a chance to fight with Xiao and compete with his genuine qi, because he knew the threat of Haotian's divine light to the powerhouses of the devil's doctrine through Yihongyu. He found two opportunities, and he was faced with two choices. When Haotian's divine light spurted out from the padao for the first time, he chose to use the Great Spirit to cooperate with Liu Bai's sword style. According to his calculation, the Great Spirit inherited from youngest uncle and Liu Bai's sword style that he had recently comprehended were his most powerful skills. In fact, he did successfully injure Xiao, but it was a pity that he could not kill him. Now that he was faced with a second chance, he was not sure what he should choose. Until he heard Xiao's cold and condescending scolding, he finally made up his mind. After using the secret method of the devil's doctrine, Xiao became extremely skinny. His eyes were sunken, and his cheeks seemed to be covered with a thin layer of skin. The bones underneath could be seen clearly, and he actually looked a little like his teacher Lotus at the front gate of the devil's doctrine. Under the blazing light, he looked even more like a god or a devil. Xiao did not hesitate to burn his life and flesh, and severely deplete his lifespan, to completely change the situation of the battle at the Snow Lake. In front of the powerful Xiao, Ning Kei did not have the slightest ability to fight back. The Haotian's divine light created by the Great Spirit could cause a certain amount of damage to him, but it could not change the overall situation of the battle. Ning Kei saw that he was about to die, but at this moment, he said thank you. This thank you was so baffling. Xiao did not know if Ning Kei had really gone crazy before he was about to die, and he could not understand why Ning Kei would thank him. However, he felt that there was something strange in this thank you, and he felt a little uneasy. Ning Kei looked at Xiao's hideous and scary skinny cheeks on the other side of the blazing light, and said with mixed emotions, I also have a natal item. Do you want to see what it is? As he said this, an extremely condensed psyche power was released from Ning Kei's body. The psyche power left the mottled blood color on his body, and floated above the Snow Lake. The adjective to describe the psyche power as floating did not mean that the psyche power was moving slowly, but the feeling it gave people was that the psyche power was extremely pure. However, it was like an ignorant child with brute force. In the chi of heaven and earth that permeated above the snow lake, it did not know where to touch. In the daytime, in front of the wind and snow palace, Xiaofan had once evaluated Ning Kei's psyche power. He said that Ning Kei's psyche power was vigorous and pure, but his control of the chi of heaven and earth was extremely bad. This was the situation now. However, Xiaofan's eyes suddenly turned cold. Because he could clearly feel that the psyche power released by Ning Kei had captured an extremely thin wisp of chi of heaven and earth on the snow lake. That wisp of chi of heaven and earth reached the cliff of the lake in an instant. Just as it landed on the edge of the cliff, that extremely thin wisp of chi of heaven and earth instantly stabilized and began to expand at an extremely terrifying speed. It was as if there was something on the cliff that was continuously pouring into this wisp of chi of heaven and earth. Holding the hilt tightly with both hands, Ning Kei's face was pale, but his eyes were bright. Risking the risk of destroying his cultivation, he dispersed the crystal-clear liquid in his abdomen with a thought and sent all the Great Spirit out at the same time to ensure that it could suppress Xiaofan's iron spear for a period of time. He had to cherish this period of time. His psyche power released from his sense of perception, passed through the extremely stagnant snow mountain and ocean of chi that only had 10 apertures open, and passed through the difficult invisible chi apertures. Finally, it converged into a very weak and clumsy little song. He hoped that this little song could be heard and understood. Because he was using this song to call his natal item. Cultivators did not rely on the chi of heaven and earth to directly affect the things in the world. Instead, they used the chi of heaven and earth as a bridge to transmit their psyche power to the object, thereby triggering the vibration of the chi of heaven and earth inside the object. The object that was most harmonious with the cultivator's psyche power and most likely to resonate was the natal item. This was what Chen Pipi said. He believed that it was very difficult for a cultivator to find a natal item that was completely compatible with his aura. That night in the old library, he spoke to Ning Kei with fervor and assurance. Using music as an example, the so-called natal item was the object that could understand and listen to his song very much. It was also the so-called bosom friend. The natal item of a sword master was the natal sword, such as Liu Bai's Day sword. Of course, as the strongest sage of sword in the world, he could now draw his natal sword on paper. The natal item of a talisman master was the natal talisman, such as Master Yen Sei's Jing Fu. This talisman was the closest to him, and until the moment before his death, they were still fighting side by side. Ning Kei was a rare dual cultivator. His natal item was not a knife, not a sword, not a natal talisman, not a writing brush, ink, paper, inkstone, mountains, rivers, trees, or even his most beloved silver. His natal item was a little handmaiden. It was the little handmaiden with yellow hair and a slightly tanned face. On the snow lake, Ning Kei's psyche power controlled the chi of heaven and earth and came to Yanming Mountain. The little song was played silently by the cliff. Chen Pipi once said that his song was very unpleasant and difficult to understand. Moreover, it was relatively far tonight, so the song was unusually dim and ethereal. It was not a tune at all. Sang Sang felt the psyche power. She heard the song and also understood it. Although there was no real music playing on Yanming Mountain, she could clearly hear a mountain song. It was a song that Ning Kei liked to hum many years ago when he carried her on his back climbing in the depths of Min Mountain. Ning Kei's acupoints were blocked and his 5 tones were not complete. The reason why he was not afraid of losing face and often hummed this song to Sang Sang was because Sang Sang liked to listen to him sing this song when she could not sleep. This song was Sang Sang's lullaby. Sang Sang held the big black umbrella and stood by the cliff with a slightly lost expression. She looked at the light in the snow lake under the cliff and did not quite understand what had happened. But she understood the call, or invitation, that Ning Ke made in the psyche power. Ning Ke was inviting her to build the closest connection, which was absolute obedience. Even the shadow of death and the threat of Yama could not tear apart the connection. However, no one in Haotian Taoism could produce purer Sangsang's divine flame than Sangsang. Because she was a descendant of light. She was the daughter of light. Under the white light, the reeds by the bridge on the west bank seemed to have become beautiful objects carved from white jade. Yi Hongyu held the railing tightly and looked at the dazzling light on the lake in the distance. She was shocked speechless. She knew that Sangsang knew divine skills, and she had discussed it with the little handmaiden. However, she never knew that Sangsang's divine skills were so strong. It should have been late at night, and they could not borrow the light of Haotian. She could not understand how Sangsang could release so much light. Although she knew that she was the only descendant of the divine priest of light in the world, and the person whom the West Hill Divine Palace wanted to invite back to Peach Mountain, she still could not understand. No one could understand the light by the Yanming Lake, including Yi Su, who was standing on the city wall. However, he did not try to understand the scene in front of him like his sister. Looking at the divine flame that illuminated the night sky and feeling the aura there, the face of the descendant of Jishou Abbey was full of piety, longing, shock, and confusion. He murmured, "What a pure light." Eldest brother, who was standing beside Yi Su, also looked in the direction of Yanming Lake. He did not change his expression, nor did he smile. Instead, he looked very serious. No one knew what he was worried about. Under the snow bridge outside the military camp, the soldiers of the Yulin Royal Guards and the cultivators of the Imperial Center Administration looked in the direction of Yanming Lake in shock. The light shone on their faces clearly. Su Shi looked up at the beautiful light reflected by the dark clouds in the night sky. His movement seemed particularly heavy, and his wrinkled face was full of questions. Second brother, who was sitting cross-legged on the snow bridge, had his head lowered most of the time from day to night. At this time, he finally raised his head and looked at the light of Yanming Lake. He showed a rare sincere smile. Then he looked at Su Shi and said, "This is a miracle." Although this was not a miracle created by the Academy, a miracle was a miracle. After Master Yen Sei and the great divine priest of light died together, second brother climbed the nameless mountain and saw the little handmaiden holding the ashes of the ashes. He felt pity for her and somehow felt that a miracle would happen to the little handmaiden in the future. For this, he did not hesitate to argue with eldest brother, whom he respected the most. Tonight, he finally saw a miracle happen to Sangsang, so he began to smile. In the winter forest on the east bank of Yanming Lake, Qin Yan's body was covered with thousands of snowflakes like cicada wings. He looked like a statue of Buddha carved from ice and snow. No matter how fierce the battle on the snow lake was, the wayfarer of Buddhism sect remained silent. He put his palms together to guard his heart against the person behind the sound of cicadas and waited for the result calmly. When Haotian's divine light appeared on the cliff, he suddenly opened his eyes. Thin snowflakes fell from his eyes. There were many complicated emotions in his gentle but firm eyes. Those emotions were compassionate, peaceful, struggling, and finally, they turned into admiration. The faint sound of cicadas in the winter forest also changed at this time. The rhythm of the cicadas strangely showed indifference and disgust, but the tone seemed to be satisfied. In the pavilion outside the snow hall of the imperial palace, Li Qingshan, the nation master of Tang, looked at the light that suddenly lit up the night sky in the south. His right hand that was stroking his beard suddenly trembled and pulled out several long strands of beard. Master Huang Yang, who was standing beside the snow bell, looked in the direction of Yanming Lake. He opened his mouth slightly and his sigh turned into a compassionate Buddhist chant. His palms seemed to unconsciously pat the surface of the bell. The thin snowflakes on the ancient bell cracked inch by inch and slid down the surface of the bell to the ground. The melodious and solemn bell sound spread far away in the daytime night. The world in Sang Sang's eyes was white at this time. Pure and flawless white. That was the color of light. Her eyes did not stay on the world of pure divine light. Instead, she silently looked at the back of the figure on the snow lake and felt the message transmitted by the psyche power. The psyche power was desperately summoning. It seemed so greedy and hungry, even with a hint of panic. It was like a devil that wanted to devour her flesh and blood. Sang Sang clearly felt this meaning, but she did not panic. In the burning Haotian divine light, she calmly opened her spiritual world and opened it to Ning Ke, who was on the other side of the psyche power. Some consciousness had long become Sang Sang's instinct. Her spirit, her flesh and blood, her divine light, her life, her everything belonged to her and Ning Quebec. She could share it with him without hesitation or offer it to him. In this case, why should she be afraid? Why should she panic? She was Ning Ke's natal, and Ning Ke was also her natal. Then she would give him as much as he wanted, even if it was all she had. Whatever he wanted, she would give him, even if it was life. If the relationship between a cultivator and his natal was intimate, then Ning Ke and Sang Sang were the best in the world. They were not high mountains and flowing rivers, but pots and pans. Their joy, anger, sorrow, and joy were interlinked. They did not need to try to understand each other. They were born to understand each other. Under the illumination of the divine light, Xiaofan looked at the cut on his chest and knew that death was coming. He slowly let go of his hand, letting the two halves of the spear fall, smashing into the snowflakes. The bell that rang from the palace in the distance finally came to Yanming Lake. Xiaofan looked up at the source of the bell, not knowing if he was thinking of his sister. The bell rang again. There was a buzzing sound in his mountain-like body, and countless fine gravel splashed out from his body and scattered around, as if it was the dust he had hidden for decades. The melodious bell rang continuously, echoing in the quiet Chang'an city. Puff! 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 Xiaoho's body made a series of muffled sounds, and the surface of his body suddenly sunk. Some parts of his body bulged, and his broken bones and flesh looked like they had been punched by someone. These were all Tang's fists. In the successive assassinations in the wilderness, Tang risked his life and serious injuries to use the blood knife to break Xiaoho's armor, leaving more than a dozen fists on his body. In the past few days, Xiaoho used his powerful genuine qi and terrifying state to forcibly suppress these fists' injuries. At this time, the Haotian divine light had melted the meridian crystal wall in his body, so he could not suppress these fists' wills, and they instantly erupted. The injuries that he had previously suppressed with the secret method of the devil's doctrine also erupted again. Countless wounds reappeared on his skin, and the scene looked extremely strange. Before death, he had to relive the injuries that he had suffered before and bear the pain again. It had to be said that this was a very cruel thing. Xiaoho's internal organs were all broken, and it could even be said that they had become rotten things. There was not much blood in his muscles, but there was still a lot of blood in his internal organs, so Xiaoho began to cough blood. The thick black blood flowed along his esophagus and trachea into his mouth, and then overflowed his lips. Xiaoho stood in the snow, coughing blood and laughing. Ning Ke sat in the snow and was silent for a long time. Then, he also laughed. The smiles of the two of them had completely different meanings. On the edge of the cliff of Yanming Mountain, Sang Sang sat in the snow, looking extremely weak. She looked at the scene on the lake in the distance and knew that Ning Ke did not want to laugh at this time, but he definitely wanted to cry. Thinking of this, her heart ached, and she began to cry. Cold tears continuously flowed down her slightly dark face, but they could not wash away the smile that gradually appeared on her face. This was really something to be happy about, so she softly hummed. We are from the mountains and rivers, and we want to take your life. We are from the riverside, and we want to take your life. We are from the grassland, and we want to take your life. We are from an uninhabited small village in the Yen territory, and we want to take your life. We are from the uninhabited general's mansion in Chang'an City, and we want to take your life. The lyrics of this song were the clumsy revenge poem that she had written for Ning Quebec. The tune was the lullaby that Ning Kei often sang to her when she was young. Song Song's voice was very soft, and a little childish. It was not pleasant to hear. But at this time, the song that came from the cliff was so moving, and it was melodious on the lake in winter. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 486. People were about to die. The night was still cold before dawn. However, the snow lake was extremely bright. Haotian's divine flame continued to burn on the ice surface and in the lake water, releasing clouds of water vapor. One could faintly hear the sound of boiling, like a hot spring in the morning. Xiaofan was covered in blood. His scattered white hair was stuck to the shape of a withered willow. He looked at Ning Kei with his dim eyes full of deep confusion. He said in a hoarse voice, "You were only 4 years old at that time. Hatred is not easy for a 4-year-old to remember. Do you really hate me so much?" The cold wind blew on his face. The smile on Ning Kei's face gradually disappeared. He said a few words. The 4 years in Chang and when I was a child were the happiest days of my previous life and this life. At that time, I didn't need to think or learn anything. I only needed to enjoy the love of my parents, play with my playmates, and secretly read the books of the general. Unfortunately, those days were destroyed by you. In the eyes of others, I lived a good life these years. But only I know how painful and unhappy it is to struggle to live every day. So of course I hate you. No matter what I've done over the years, the housekeeper and the young master who I killed in the woodshed will never come back to life. The people who died in the general's mansion will never come back to life. My parents will never come back to life. My best days will never come back to me. So, no one or anything can stop me from killing you. I want them to know that it's worthwhile for me to wield that knife. I also want you to know that I'm avenging my parents. My father's name is Lin Tao, and my mother's name is Li Sanyang. Xiaofan looked down at the knife wound on his chest and abdomen. He suddenly asked, "How does it feel to have your revenge?" Ning Kei said, "It feels good." Xiaofan raised his head and felt a little confused. He said, "How does it feel?" "I don't know what kind of feeling it is. Anyway, I feel very relaxed. I always feel that the world has become different after your death. I am no longer the same person I was in the past 15 years. Ning Kei thought for a while and said, "I understand why I feel relaxed. Because after your death, I can have more time to write calligraphy to earn money, instead of writing many boring talismans every night. After your death, I can often go to the House of Red Sleeves to listen to music, instead of listening to senior brother's music at the back of the mountain of the academy. After you die, I will still cultivate, but I won't be doing it to make myself stronger like I did in the past years. I will do it purely for my interests and hobbies, or to satisfy my desire to seek Tao. After you die, I won't have to stare at your back and wait for the battle in the city of Wei or Chang, unlike I used to. I can go to the great river of the South Jin Kingdom, to the East Sea of the Divine Hall, and to see the world and the people living in it. He looked at Xiaofan and said very seriously, after you die, I won't have to think about killing you anymore. Only then can I obtain true freedom and do what I want to do. Xiaofan laughed. His laughter was very sad, and his expression was very strange. Freedom, Xiaofan looked at Ning Ke with eyes full of pity and mockery. He said, as a disciple of the orthodox faction, you have been deeply involved in the devil's doctrine, just like how I betrayed the devil's doctrine. You have already followed my old path, and are destined to struggle for survival in the gap between light and darkness. How can you obtain true freedom, and naturally, you won't have any happiness. Ning Ke used the padao as a crutch, supported his weak body, and stood up with difficulty. He looked at Xiaofan and said, the academy is not the enlightenment doctrine, and I am not you. Those who did not have a deep understanding of the academy could not understand the true attitude of the academy, especially the headmaster of the academy towards the devil's doctrine. Ning Ke never worried that he would become the hero in the story. The academy is indeed not the enlightenment doctrine. With the headmaster of the academy's breadth of mind, he would not care about what his disciple cultivates. But you are indeed not me. You are simply, not a human. The light in Xiaoho's eyes, which had been dim like a firefly that could be killed by the cold wind at any time, became bright at this moment. He said sternly, you are the son of Yama. 15 years ago, the divine priest of light thought that the son of Yama had been born in the Xianwei general's mansion, and the West Hill divine palace had instructed Xiaoho to carry out a purge. That was why there were so many stories and tonight's bloody battle. Before Xiaoho died, he recalled the doubts of tonight's battle. Those who were not there but had arrived through Ning Ke became more and more convinced of this judgment. He looked at Ning Ke and smiled strangely. He cursed with resentment, Haotian above, you, the son of Yama, will one day be burned to ashes by Haotian's divine light, just like me. I am the son of Yama, which probably makes it easier for you to accept the fact that you will die in my hands. But unfortunately, I have nothing to do with Yama. Ning Ke said, and each of us will die eventually, and we will all be burned to ashes by Haotian's divine light. So your curse means nothing to me. You are really not the son of Yama? Xiaoho murmured, if you are not the son of Yama, how could you escape from Chang'an at such a young age? If you are not the son of Yama, how could you surpass the state and defeat me? How could I die today? His cheeks were as wrinkled as a willow tree that had been split open by lightning, full of confusion and unwillingness. Chapter 487. The fire on the lake gradually died out, and the chill gradually rose. Tang Xiaotang walked behind Ning Ke and let go of Chen Pipi's hand. Suddenly, she knelt down with a thud, and 2 puffs of snow splashed from her knees. Then, she kowtowed heavily. Chen Pipi was slightly shocked. Tang Xiaotang said in a trembling voice, "Thank you, youngest uncle, for cleaning up the Enlightenment doctrine." Ning Ke did not move sideways to avoid it. He calmly accepted the big bow. He was very clear that the devil's doctrine, which had already withered in the world, respected and feared youngest uncle. However, the one they truly hated was Xiaoho, the traitor. If he did not make Tang Xiaotang kneel, she would not be able to release the complex emotions in her heart. Moreover, Lotus consciousness fragment was in his sense of perception, so he was doing it on behalf of Lotus. But he looked at the quiet night sky of the lake and said, "There are many people by the lake. I'm afraid there will be some trouble if you kneel down." Tang Xiaotang stood up, and Chen Pipi wiped the snow off her forehead. Looking at the red and swollen forehead, he could not help feeling distressed. Hearing Ning Ke's words, he replied, "We are in Chang'an, so there will be no trouble." Today's battle with Xiaofan had not been disturbed as he had expected. Of course, Ning Ke was very clear that it must be the academy that played a role in it. Hearing Chen Pipi's words, he could not help but laugh, and his heart was suddenly filled with pride. This was Chang'an, and they were disciples of the academy, so there would be no trouble. But what should he do next? The hatred and killing intent that had accumulated for 15 years were all released as Xiao's body fell into the lake. Just like the mist that was spewing out from the boiling lake, an ordinary person would probably feel a little empty and perplexed after experiencing great joy and excitement. They would even be at a loss as to what to do. If Ning Ke was still the Ning Ke in the city of Wei, he would probably fall into such a state of mind. After killing Xiaoho, it seemed that he had done all that he wanted to do in this life. There was nothing else to do, and he did not even know where to go. But now it was different. He had a home in Chang'an, and it was inconvenient to return to the old brush pen shop on Lin 47th Street. He also had a large house by the Yanming Lake. Although it was already ruined, it was still livable. Besides, there was the academy in the south of Chang'an, and he could always find a hut in the back mountain. Let's go home first. Holding each other's arms, they walked to the house on the north bank of the lake where the fire had long been extinguished. However, although they were not seriously injured today, they were extremely exhausted and had already reached the point of exhaustion. Instead, it would make him feel gratified. Most importantly, he did not think that Ning Ke would become a second Mr. Ku. He turned to look at eldest brother and said, "Until now, are you still not sure?" Eldest brother asked. The West Hill Divine Palace said that it was a presumptuous judgment. Why do you insist on it? I have said that I believe that the Divine Priest of Light may have made a wrong judgment, but he would never make a presumptuous judgment. Back then, the headmaster might have judged that the son of Lin Guangyuan could not be the son of Yama. That was why he thought that the Divine Priest of Light had made a big mistake. That was why the Divine Hall apologized to the Tang Empire. However, if the Divine Priest of Light was right, and the son of Yama was awakened in the general's mansion, then who could it be if not the son of Lin Guangyuan? Yi Su looked at him expressionlessly and said, "You know very well who it is." Eldest brother said, "Without evidence, there is no reason." Yi Su said, "Everyone is dead, but Ning Ke is still alive. This is the evidence." Eldest brother did not speak. Yi Su's words were simple and seemed unreasonable, but they could not be refuted. To be able to survive under any circumstances, even when death seemed inevitable, if he was not the son of God who was protected by Haotian, then he could only be the hero of the story. The black line had descended on the human world for 15 years, and the story had begun for 15 years. No one knew that the hero of the story was the son of Yama. Yi Su believed that Ning Ke was the son of Yama. The morning light appeared in the distance in the east, and it was quiet on the city wall. After an unknown period of time, the eldest brother said, "Teacher once said that if we can't be sure of the existence above the sky, then we should maintain spiritual reverence or vigilance. However, we should not pay any attention to it in our lives in the real world. This is the way to get along." Then he looked at Yi Su and said, "I am not sure if Ning Ke is the son of Yama. I believe that he is not, but I am very sure that he is the youngest brother of the academy." Yi Su quietly thought about the headmaster's words. After a while, he looked at the winter forest by the Yanming Lake and said indifferently, "Without evidence and without heaven's decree, even if Haotian Taoism has doubts, they will not do anything to Ning Quebec. I think the mute needs to hear these words, but I am very doubtful that he, who can no longer speak, can hear these words." The mute was not really mute, so naturally, he would not be really deaf. The so-called "can hear" referred to whether he wanted to hear and whether he was willing to believe the Academy's words. Eldest brother looked at the winter forest and thought of the wayfarer of the Buddhism sect who was known for his perseverance. A faint look of worry appeared on his face. The wayfarer of the Buddhism sect had obviously come to Chang'an because of the rumor of the son of Yama. Since he dared to reveal his whereabouts, he naturally would not be afraid of the Academy's pressure and harm Ning Quebec. He really did not have any good way to deal with the mute monk, because as he often repeated but no one believed, eldest brother was really not good at fighting. Yi Su looked at the quiet night forest and always felt that something was wrong. Because in the previous battle, the mute monk did not make a move, and he always felt that there was someone else in the forest. However, in this world, who could avoid the eyes of him and Mr. First of the Academy? At this moment, a sudden gust of wind blew in the winter forest by the lake. Along with the wind, there was a large wave of sad cicadas that made people want to cry, but the cicadas sounded so happy. Listening to the cicadas, Yi Su's face suddenly became extremely pale. It was not fear, but solemnity. It was the emotion of meeting the most powerful enemy in his life. There was only a very clear whistling sound. The wooden sword on his back also whistled and suddenly unsheathed. The sword was like a ray of light, flying away from the city wall, piercing the last trace of darkness before dawn, and stabbing towards the winter forest. Then, Yi Su jumped down from the city wall. In the morning wind, his robe fluttered slightly, and he followed the sword. His body movement was indescribably wonderful, like a thin piece of snow in the wind, and actually seemed to be no slower than the flying sword. I haven't figured out the next volume yet, so I was afraid in advance. That's why it was very difficult to write today. I want to report to everyone, and I will draft the next volume in my mind before going to bed. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for it. Your support is my biggest motivation. As the successor of the Jishou Abbey, Yi Su was even more vigilant. Qi Nian had been practicing the silent meditation for 15 years and was extremely powerful. Once he opened his mouth, the sound of Buddha would be heard in the world. However, he did not open his mouth last night in the face of the mournful chirping of the 23-year cicada cultivation and the silent but bone-chilling suppression of that person. Because he was not sure that he could win against that person if he opened his mouth. Therefore, he did not answer Yi Su's question at this time. Yi Su knew the mute monk's temperament well. Seeing that he didn't speak, he knew that he couldn't get any information about the 23-year cicada cultivation from him. He turned to look at the eldest brother and said, "This is Chang'an." His words were simple, but the meaning was clear. This was not the West Hill or the Xiankong Temple, but Chang'an of the Tang Empire, the territory of the Academy. The master of the devil's doctrine came and left at will, which was a provocation to the Academy. At this time, the Academy should at least give an explanation. The eldest brother said, "All these years, that person has been attacking General Xiahou. He has given the Academy enough face. This time, I didn't expect him to come out." Yi Su looked at the dead minister of offerings from Qinghe County and suddenly raised his finger to the thin piece of snow on his neck. He said, "He killed you in Chang'an. Does Mr. First not want to enforce the law of the Tang Empire on behalf of the Academy?" The eldest brother sighed and said, "The Academy does put the law of the Tang Empire first, but the law depends on the ability of the executor. The law of the Tang Empire can only restrict those who are able to be restricted by the Tangs. Neither the imperial court nor the Academy can do anything to this person. We can't ask the headmaster for help." Yi Su was puzzled. In his opinion, even though the headmaster of the Academy had not been involved in the affairs of the world for many years, the reappearance of the 23-year cicada cultivation in the world was a big event. Was this not enough to alarm the headmaster? No one spoke, or did not know what to say. The mysterious appearance and disappearance of the 23-year cicada cultivation made the three most powerful people in the academy, Taoism and Buddhism, subconsciously silent. The morning light gradually brightened, and the snow particles in the winter forest slowly danced in the light. They still looked like a large pair of cicada wings, but much fainter than before. Yi Su looked at the snow fog in the morning light and the pair of cicada wings. Suddenly, his expression changed slightly. Last night, he and the eldest brother had been watching Yanming Lake from the city wall, but they did not notice the movement in the winter forest. After the Taoist with the yellow oiled paper umbrella under his armpit left to report the news, an indescribable atmosphere of celebration mixed with some shock and confusion began to spread in the rain corridors and balconies. Li Yu stroked her slightly rising and falling chest and looked at the cup of tea in front of her. It took her great willpower to calm herself down. Ning Ke actually defeated Xiaofan. This had brought great benefits. Even a calm person like her felt a little dizzy. But the fact that Ning Ke was still alive made her suddenly relaxed. Li Huiyuan sat beside her, looking a little confused. Of course, he knew that Xiaofan was killed, and it was a good thing for him. But he couldn't understand why his sister and the counselors were so ecstatic. Could the Empress be sure of everything even if the military support was gone? He hadn't slept for a whole night, and now he just wanted to go to sleep. Li Yu waved her hand to let the counselors leave, but she didn't let him leave. The room was quiet. She looked at her favorite brother, and her clear eyes gradually became moist. She said in a slightly trembling voice, "After today, the future throne of the Tang Empire will be yours, my brother. I almost wrote myself to death. I want to vomit sitting in front of the computer. That's all for today. Tomorrow, the second volume will officially end. I hope I can get through these few days. There are always a few days at the end of each volume. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation." When the Grand Secretary Xingjing and his wife went to see their daughter, they behaved. Since there were servants, Chen Pipi and Xiao Tang returned to the academy. Chen Pipi and Tang returned to the academy and Tang went back to the academy. Since the servants were taken care, Chen and Xiao Tang returned to Chang. Chen. You and I, Yi went. S Ming, S and Li, S Feng and S and S S S S S S S S Ming, S S S S S S could T S S S S S S S S S. Chen S S S S, Chen's, T U S of, Ning Ke and Sang Sang were not seriously injured in the battle at the Winter Lake. It was not until Xiaofan used his iron spear that they started to bleed. However, this seemingly victorious battle still caused great damage to their spirits and bodies. After Ning Ke released the talisman storm in the house, triggered the explosion in the lotus field, and shot the 13 talisman arrows, the psyche power in his sense of perception and even the great spirit in his body were completely exhausted. Sang Sang's last burst of light on the cliff was almost a means of burning the essence of life. The light in the small building was gone, leaving only darkness. Her body was as cold as a block of ice. Ning Ke was very worried that the cold in her body would relapse. Before going to bed, he held her in his arms and warmed her body with his body temperature, just like in the past. However, his right arm was seriously injured because of the backfire of the talisman arrow. He was not used to using his left arm, so he only held her gently. The next morning, Sang Sang woke up. However, she had a terrible headache and could not get up. Ning Ke was also extremely weak. He dragged her back to bed and asked the maids to bring her food and water. He did not allow her to get up to do housework. After lying in bed for 3 days and 3 nights, Ning Kei's spirit gradually recovered. He climbed out of bed and entered the garden in the morning light. He found his padao and began to hack and slash. The sound of the padao whistled and the cold light shone like snow. Suddenly, he seemed to have thought of something and stopped. He stood in the middle of the winter courtyard, his body seemed to be a little stiff. He looked at the padao in his hand and remained silent for a long time. In the past few years, as long as there were no emergencies, he would get up early in the morning and wash and eat with Sang Sang's help. Then, he would start to practice. Whether it was his swordsmanship, archery, or meditation, he had never slacked off. This was because he was always facing the threat of death and the pressure of revenge. This morning seemed to be the same as the other ordinary mornings in the past. But in fact, this morning was very different from the past. He was now a student of the 2nd floor of the academy. There were not many people in the world who could threaten his life. Moreover, Xiaofan was already dead. Ning Kei and Sang Sang held the big black umbrella and sent her to the gate of the courtyard. He looked at the newly renovated courtyard gate and recalled the scene on that rainy day. He sighed and said, "I really did not think that I would actually live with you for half a year." Yi Hongyu said, "You'd better not say such shallow and boring words in the future." "I will try to say something elegant and boring in the future." Ning Kei said, "You were forced to escape from the divine hall because you offended the great divine priest of judgment. After leaving Chang'an, where can you find a piece of pure land in the world? According to what you said that day, Yi Su would not care about the affairs of the divine hall, nor would he care about your life. Aren't you worried that you will be killed by the divine hall?" Yi Hongyu said, "Life and death is the most personal thing, and it is also something that people can't control themselves. We can't pin our hopes on others, even my brother. But I want to control myself. You are a Taoist. I will not engage in such a mysterious debate with you." Ning Kei replied with a smile. Then he reached out and brushed off a thin layer of snow that fell on his shoulder. With this action, the extremely shallow dimples on his face suddenly became clear. Yi Hongyu looked at the shallow dimples on his face and looked at his smile. She thought silently, what kind of life can make such a shameless and cold-blooded guy have such a beautiful smile? There is something that I have never understood. She suddenly said. Ning Kei was slightly startled and asked, "What is it?" Yi Hongyu said, "In terms of cultivation talent, I am clearly far better than you. However, my understanding of the paper sword is far inferior to yours. From the West Hill to Chang'an, I exhausted a lot of energy and finally understood most of it. However, you only looked at it for a night and could imitate the sword style and sword momentum so well." Ning Kei thought about it and said, "I don't really understand either. Have you thought of an answer?" Yi Hongyu said, "That day on the snow lake, you condensed the day sword style on the saber and stabbed it into Xiao's body. At that time, I saw the scene and the sword momentum that was like a torrential turbid wave. Thinking of your tragic life, I vaguely thought of a possibility." Ning Kei asked, "What possibility?" Yi Hongyu said, "The true meaning of the paper sword is not that it is so thin that there is no gap that it cannot penetrate and kill everyone. It is also not that it is the majestic momentum of the vast ocean falling from the sky. It is the simplest principle of water flow. All the water in the world will inevitably flow downwards and cannot be traced back. This is absolute no return. In other words, you will do what you think is right. In this aspect, there is no doubt that you are a powerhouse." Ning Kei said with a smile, "So this is the principle." I originally thought that you were going to say that I am a despicable person, so I can understand such a despicable swordsmanship. There is more today. I will finish the second volume. When will I finish it? I don't know. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Third sister, Yu Lian, was not at the back of the mountain. As usual, she was writing hairpin-style small regular script by the east window of the old library. She looked calm and focused. Suddenly, she looked up at the falling snowflakes outside the window and smiled. She raised her hand to her lips and gently breathed out the hot air, feeling much warmer. Tang Xiaotang was her disciple. She had no homework today, so she was grinding the ink in the old library. At this time, the little girl's hands were already sore, but her little face was still full of sweet smile. Third sister was a little confused and asked, "What makes you so happy?" "My brother has always wanted to kill the traitor Xiaofan. I heard that he was seriously injured in the wilderness to kill him. He must be very happy to know this news." Tang Xiaotang raised her arm and wiped away the tears of happiness. She looked at her teacher and nodded hard. She smiled and said, "If the headmaster is still alive, he must be very happy." One day, the snow in Chang'an suddenly became heavy and fell on the city. It was a violent mess. Ning Ke happened to go to the tombs on that day, so he had to go out of the city against the wind and snow. Ning Ke and Sang Sang first went to the grave in the deep grass near the academy and talked to Yen Sei about some boring things. Then he poured a jar of new wine in front of the grave and took out an undergarment that still had its fragrance from his bosom. He covered it with the wind and snow and burned it. Sang Sang said uneasily, "Will Dewdrop be angry?" Ning Ke said, "How will she know if you don't tell her?" After finishing these things, he and Sang Sang took a carriage to another cemetery. They followed the address that the bodyguard office helped them to find. After many turns in the forest of tombstones, they finally found Darky's grave. Ning Ke gently brushed away the snow on the tombstone and looked at the name. He said with a sense of guilt, "When we were young, we agreed that if someone died first, the one who killed Xiaofan would bring his head to the grave of the one who died first. I'm sorry that I didn't do it." Xiaofan's body was sealed in the coffin after being fished out of the lake by the military. I was also embarrassed to break the coffin and behead him. But I heard that he looked very miserable, like a piece of meat stewed in a pot. After saying these disgusting words, Ning Ke laughed happily. Then he took the 2 parts of the dark and heavy broken spear from Song Song's hands and deeply put them into the frozen soil of the tomb, like 2 long sticks of incense. There is one more chapter. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. You're tuning into the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.